For 31 days, America held its breath. A child was missing. A little girl only 2 years old vanished without a trace. Her name was Caylee Anthony, and the one person who should have been searching for her never did. It began on a quiet summer day in Orlando, Florida, a day that seemed ordinary, yet beneath the surface, a darkness was quietly unfolding. Behind the closed doors of the Anthony household, a story of disappearance, deceit, and shocking behavior was about to grip the nation. Caylee's grandmother, Cindy Anthony, first noticed something was wrong on July 15, 2008. She realized that her granddaughter had not been seen for weeks. Panic set in, and she contacted the authorities. But what the police encountered was more unsettling than a simple missing child report. Caylee Anthony, Caylee's mother, seemed strangely calm, almost detached, as if the disappearance of her own child was not an immediate concern. When questioned by law enforcement, Caylee provided a series of conflicting statements. One day she claimed that Caylee had been left with a nanny. The next day, she said she had last seen her playing in the backyard. Every story contradicted the previous one, leaving investigators puzzled and wary. Each lie, each pause, each inconsistent detail added to a growing sense of unease surrounding the case. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors and friends began to share their observations, painting a disturbing picture. Some recalled hearing strange noises coming from the Anthony home, occasional cries, or unsettling sounds in the middle of the night. Others remembered seeing Caylee out at social events, attending parties, laughing, and acting as if nothing had changed in her life, while her daughter had been missing for weeks. The stark contrast between the innocence of a lost child and the apparent normalcy of her mother's behavior sent chills through everyone involved. Authorities knew the first days of any missing child case were critical. Every hour that passed could mean the difference between finding Caylee alive or discovering a tragedy. Police began canvassing the neighborhood, checking homes, cars, and anyone who might have seen the little girl. Yet despite the mounting concern, Caylee continued to provide contradictory information, further complicating the investigation. The first week of Caylee's disappearance was a whirlwind of confusion, anxiety, and mounting suspicion. Every lead seemed to take investigators in circles. Caylee Anthony's story shifted with each telling. Sometimes she claimed she had last seen Caylee playing in the backyard. Other times she insisted the child had been left with a friend who never existed. Police combed through her home meticulously, searching for any hint of the child's whereabouts. They inspected rooms, closets, and even outdoor areas, yet there was no sign of Caylee. The tension within the Anthony household was palpable, but not in the way one might expect. Caylee's demeanor remained unsettlingly calm. She smiled at neighbors, chatted casually with friends, and even made time for social events, seemingly unconcerned by the disappearance of her own daughter. Investigators could not understand how a mother could appear so indifferent, and the contradiction only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, Cindy Anthony, the grandmother, grew increasingly desperate. She tried to reach Caylee repeatedly, pleading for information, for any sign of Caylee. Yet each conversation revealed inconsistencies, moments of hesitation, and statements that didn't add up. The police began to take a closer look at the family's history, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who had contact with the Anthony household. Slowly, a troubling picture emerged, not of a frantic mother searching for her child, but of a young woman whose behavior raised more questions than it answered. Every contradictory statement, every delay in reporting, every casual social outing painted a portrait of confusion, mistrust, and possible deception. Investigators also began examining Caylee's digital footprint. Her internet searches over the past weeks revealed queries that sent shivers down the spines of the officers. How to make chloroform, how to dispose of a body, and other chillingly specific searches about killing a child. It was as though the darkness of what might have occurred was quietly surfacing online, hidden behind the mundane appearance of everyday searches. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed, recounting small but alarming details, times when Caylee seemed unconcerned about Caylee, or when she laughed and socialized while her child was missing. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every inconsistent statement began weaving a web of suspicion that investigators found impossible to ignore. By the second week, the investigation had shifted into a high-intensity manhunt, with law enforcement treating every lead as potentially critical. Detectives meticulously retraced Caylee's steps, spoke to anyone who had been near the Anthony residence, and analyzed every detail from phone records to credit card transactions. Each passing day without Caylee heightened the sense of urgency, and the public's fascination. News outlets across the country began covering the story nonstop, feeding a national obsession with the missing child. Headlines screamed, theories circulated wildly on talk shows, and viewers dissected every interview, every facial expression, every minor slip in Caylee's statements. Inside the Anthony home, the atmosphere was eerie. Caylee's outward composure contrasted sharply with the fear and despair gripping Cindy Anthony, who could barely sleep or eat. The grandmother tirelessly pleaded with Caylee for information, hoping for a breakthrough, yet she was met with vague answers, half-truths, and sometimes outright lies. Detectives noted Caylee's inconsistent timelines. She would place Caylee at a friend's house, then later revise the story to the backyard, or even suggest she had last seen the child weeks earlier. Each conflicting account made it increasingly difficult to piece together the truth, and with every contradiction, suspicion grew. The forensic aspect of the investigation was also starting to take shape. Police inspected Caylee's car, her home, and the surrounding areas for any physical evidence that might lead them to Caylee. They began to piece together a timeline of where Caylee had been, what she had been doing, and who she had interacted with since the child's disappearance. Friends were questioned, neighbors interrogated, and anyone connected to the Anthony family was scrutinized. The investigators felt they were closing in on answers, but the deeper they dug, the more complex and unsettling the case became. Adding to the tension were the increasingly bizarre discoveries from Caylee's online activity. Searches for lethal chemicals, methods of killing, and other sinister topics began to emerge, painting a chilling digital portrait. While some argued these could be innocent curiosity or unrelated searches, the investigators knew that in combination with Caylee's inconsistent statements and social behavior, they painted a far darker picture than anyone could have imagined. The public, meanwhile, was captivated. Late-night shows, news anchors, and online forums debated every possibility. People speculated about kidnappings, stranger danger, and parental negligence. Letters poured into law enforcement and media organizations, filled with theories, accusations, and pleas for Caylee's safe return. The nation became both witness and jury, waiting, watching, and judging, even before a courtroom would ever open its doors. By the third week, the case had evolved from a simple missing child report into a full-blown investigation, tinged with suspicion, fear, and a growing sense of dread. Authorities had begun piecing together what little evidence they could find, but each clue seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. Caylee's behavior remained the most confounding element. While detectives worked tirelessly, she continued to socialize, attend parties, and present herself to the public as an ordinary young woman, entirely unaffected by the chaos surrounding her child's disappearance. Cindy Anthony's desperation intensified. She made public pleas for her granddaughter's safe return, appearing on television and giving interviews. She described the missing child, her habits, her favorite toys, and the last known interactions with her family. Each interview was heartfelt, desperate, and tinged with anger toward Caylee, whose seeming indifference was now drawing widespread scrutiny. The contrast between grandmotherly fear and maternal detachment was stark and unnerving, capturing the attention of Americans nationwide. Investigators began to notice small but significant details in Caylee's story. Certain times and dates simply didn't align. Witness statements contradicted her accounts, and the more detectives cross-referenced phone records, receipts, and alibis, the more holes appeared. Every lie, every misdirection, every omission was like another thread in a tapestry of deception, each one pulling tighter as authorities attempted to unravel the truth. The online evidence became increasingly disturbing. Caylee's search history included detailed information on chemicals, ways to render someone unconscious, and methods of disposing of a body. Combined with her evasive behavior and inconsistent statements, the evidence painted a chilling portrait. It was a portrait of a woman who had mastered the art of appearing normal, while something horrific might have occurred in her own home. The investigators knew they were on the edge of a breakthrough, but the final pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly out of reach. Meanwhile, media coverage had reached a fever pitch. Every new detail was broadcast live, discussed on news panels, dissected on talk shows, and debated in homes across the country. The story was no longer just a missing child case, it had become a national obsession. People questioned every motive, every glance, every word spoken by Caylee, projecting their own suspicions and fears onto the narrative. By this point, the case had taken on a life of its own, driven as much by public fascination as by law enforcement's tireless efforts. As the fourth week approached, the investigation took on an even darker tone. Authorities began to treat Caylee Anthony not just as a confused or careless mother, but as a person of interest whose actions required close scrutiny. Detectives re-interviewed friends, neighbors, and coworkers, probing every detail of her life since Caylee's disappearance. Each new testimony seemed to add a layer of complexity and unease. Some friends recalled that Caylee appeared unusually carefree, even joking about everyday things, while her child was missing. Others described moments of evasiveness, subtle lies, and behaviors that didn't make sense. The timeline of the missing 31 days became the focal point. Investigators tried to reconstruct Caylee's movements hour by hour. Receipts, phone logs, and witness accounts slowly revealed patterns that conflicted with her statements. Every discrepancy raised suspicion. Each day without Caylee's presence highlighted a disturbing possibility that something had happened inside the Anthony home, something hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. Law enforcement also intensified forensic efforts. Caylee's vehicle, her home, and even the surrounding wooded areas were meticulously examined for any trace of evidence. Forensic teams discovered troubling signs that indicated the possible presence of chemicals and other materials that could be connected to foul play. Each discovery added tension and dread to an already fraught investigation, and investigators began to prepare for the possibility that Caylee's disappearance was far more sinister than initially imagined. At the same time, the digital evidence continued to alarm investigators. Searches related to chloroform, methods of suffocation, and disposal of bodies suggested premeditation, or at the very least, a morbid curiosity that could not be ignored. Experts debated whether these searches could be considered direct evidence of wrongdoing, but combined with Caylee's contradictory statements and her strange social behavior, they formed a pattern that was impossible to overlook. Meanwhile, the public's obsession reached unprecedented levels. News stations broadcast every detail live. Social media exploded with theories, accusations, and speculation. Late-night commentators analyzed every gesture, every pause, every word spoken by Caylee during interviews. The case had evolved from a private tragedy into a national spectacle, a story that gripped the imagination and moral conscience of a nation desperate for answers. By the fifth week, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Authorities were no longer just searching for a missing child. They were now piecing together a case that could potentially reveal a horrifying truth. Detectives continued to reconstruct the days Caylee had been unaccounted for, using every available resource: phone records, credit card transactions, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies. Every detail mattered. Every minor inconsistency could be the key to unlocking the mystery. Caylee's behavior continued to baffle investigators and the public alike. While detectives were piecing together evidence, Caylee maintained an unsettling normalcy. She went out with friends, attended social events, and presented herself as if her child's disappearance were merely a minor inconvenience. Each instance of normal behavior, each laugh or casual comment, seemed to mock the anxiety and fear surrounding Caylee's absence. Friends recalled moments when Caylee's responses seemed rehearsed, unnatural, or detached, little clues that now seemed significant in hindsight. The psychological profile of Caylee Anthony became an area of intense scrutiny. Experts were called in to analyze her demeanor, her responses, and her interactions with both her family and investigators. Some noted signs of sociopathy, while others suggested that she was simply overwhelmed or incapable of normal maternal empathy. Yet for law enforcement, the concern remained. Could a mother remain so outwardly calm while her child was missing, or worse, harmed? Meanwhile, forensic examinations uncovered additional troubling evidence. Traces of chloroform were detected in Caylee's car, raising further questions about her involvement. Investigators also noted unusual behavior regarding Caylee's belongings, as well as inconsistencies in the stories Caylee had provided about her daughter's last known locations. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the possibility of foul play, intensifying the scrutiny on Caylee and narrowing the window for any plausible explanations of innocence. The public's obsession reached fever pitch. Headlines dominated newspapers, television, and online platforms. People dissected Caylee's every move, debated possible motives, and speculated on what might have occurred during the days Caylee was missing. Communities across America felt a mix of horror, fascination, and moral outrage, as the narrative of the missing child intertwined with questions of parental responsibility, deception, and the darkest possibilities of human behavior. As the investigation entered its sixth week, pressure mounted on law enforcement to uncover answers before the trail went cold. Detectives now treated Caylee Anthony not just as a witness, but as a central figure whose every action and statement required intense scrutiny. Every day without clarity intensified the tension, not only for the authorities but for the public, who had become increasingly invested in the case. Caylee Anthony, the grandmother, became the voice of urgency and despair. She continued to plead for Caylee's safe return, giving interviews, appearing on television, and speaking to reporters with a mixture of fear, grief, and frustration. Each public statement highlighted the stark contrast between a desperate family member and Caylee's apparent indifference. The contrast was haunting, drawing national attention and fueling speculation about what might have really happened inside the Anthony household. Investigators began to map Caylee's every movement during the missing period, reconstructing timelines down to hours. Witness accounts, receipts, and phone records were cross-referenced to find patterns or inconsistencies. Each contradiction in Caylee's story heightened suspicion. Investigators questioned friends and acquaintances repeatedly, searching for small details that could unlock the truth. They knew that in cases like these, even the smallest clue, a misplaced receipt, an overlooked phone call, a casual comment, could be crucial. At the same time, digital evidence continued to raise alarms. The disturbing search history found on Caylee's computer and phone suggested knowledge or premeditation of harmful acts. Investigators debated the significance of the searches. Were they morbid curiosity or evidence pointing to something far darker? Combined with Caylee's evasive statements and unusual social behavior, the pattern was increasingly hard to ignore. The tension in the investigation was building, each passing day drawing law enforcement, the media, and the public deeper into the mystery of Caylee's disappearance. The media frenzy surrounding the case intensified. Every news outlet reported minute details, broadcasting interviews, analyzing facial expressions, and speculating on motives. Social media and online forums exploded with theories, accusations, and debates. The story had transformed into a national spectacle, one that captured not just attention, but the collective imagination of a nation, each person trying to piece together the puzzle of a missing child, a mother's lies, and a community desperate for answers. By the seventh week, the case had evolved into something far more ominous than anyone had anticipated. Investigators had begun to focus not only on locating Caylee, but also on determining what had happened during those critical 31 days. Caylee Anthony's actions, statements, and movements were now under intense scrutiny. Each conflicting account she gave created new lines of inquiry, forcing detectives to dig deeper, revisit witnesses, and reconstruct the timeline in painstaking detail. The atmosphere around the Anthony household grew tense. Neighbors recalled fleeting moments that seemed innocuous at the time, but now took on a sinister significance. A casual remark, a strange behavior, or an unexplained absence suddenly became a clue. Friends described Caylee's demeanor as oddly carefree, sometimes laughing, sometimes appearing distracted, as if unaware or uncaring of the gravity of her child's absence. Investigators began to question whether this behavior was natural denial, a defense mechanism, or something far more calculating. Forensic evidence started to add clarity, but also raised new questions. Chloroform traces in Caylee's car, combined with inconsistencies in her statements, suggested a disturbing possibility. Experts examined the substance and its potential use, cross-referencing it with Caylee's timeline and her online searches. The pattern emerging was unsettling, a combination of deliberate actions and deceit that investigators could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Public interest had reached a fever pitch. News channels broadcast every new development live, dissecting Caylee's words and body language. Talk shows, forums, and online communities erupted with theories about what had happened to Caylee, speculating on motives, scenarios, and potential outcomes. The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national obsession, a story that captured the fear, anger, and curiosity of millions across America. Meanwhile, Caylee Anthony continued her desperate search, working with authorities, reaching out to the public, and pleading for any information about her granddaughter. Her anguish contrasted sharply with Caylee's enigmatic calm, creating a narrative that seemed almost too bizarre to believe. Investigators, media, and the public alike were now caught in a tense dance between hope, suspicion, and the terrifying possibility that the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. By the 8th week, law enforcement had begun to piece together a clearer, but far more disturbing, picture of the missing days. Every moment of Caylee Anthony's behavior, every interaction she had, and every minor inconsistency in her story was scrutinized. Investigators reconstructed timelines with painstaking precision, cross-referencing phone records, receipts, witness statements, and surveillance footage. Each discovery, no matter how small, seemed to deepen the shadow of suspicion surrounding Caylee. Friends and acquaintances provided critical insights into her behavior during those missing weeks. Some recalled casual conversations in which Caylee appeared unusually carefree, almost indifferent, while others described moments where she seemed anxious but evasive when asked about Caylee. Investigators noted every hesitation, every pause, every contradictory detail, knowing that even the smallest observation could provide a breakthrough in understanding what had truly happened. Forensic analysis continued to reveal chilling details. Traces of chloroform in Caylee's car suggested knowledge of chemicals that could incapacitate or harm a child. The combination of digital searches on chemical compounds, methods of harming a child, and ways to conceal evidence added to the investigators' mounting concern. It became increasingly difficult to separate coincidence from intentional action, and each discovery tightened the noose of suspicion around Caylee Anthony. Meanwhile, the nation watched, captivated and horrified. Media outlets ran non-stop coverage, analyzing every word and facial expression of Caylee and her family. Social media exploded with speculation, creating an echo chamber of theories, accusations, and moral judgment. Public debate reached fever pitch as millions tried to piece together a narrative from fragments of facts, conjecture, and emotion. The story had become bigger than a missing child. It had become a mirror reflecting the darkest possibilities of human behavior, obsession, and deceit. Amidst this chaos, Cindy Anthony's resolve only grew stronger. She continued to advocate for her granddaughter, speaking to the media, participating in search efforts, and tirelessly urging anyone with information to come forward. Her grief, urgency, and fear stood in stark contrast to Caylee's outward composure, magnifying the mystery and suspense. Investigators were now operating under the knowledge that they were dealing with a mother who could conceal far more than they initially imagined, and that every passing day could bring them closer to uncovering an unimaginable truth. As the investigation pressed into the 9th week, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. The case had transformed from a missing child report into a full-scale criminal investigation, with Caylee Anthony at its center. Detectives knew they were dealing with a situation that demanded meticulous attention to detail. Every statement, every movement, every interaction was dissected for inconsistencies, lies, and hidden meanings. The timeline of Caylee's disappearance became a critical focus. Investigators worked to map out Caylee's activities hour by hour, day by day. Receipts, phone records, and witness accounts were analyzed repeatedly, cross-referenced against each other to uncover patterns or contradictions. Every small inconsistency became a thread in a web that investigators were slowly unraveling. They began to sense that the days Caylee was missing were not a series of random events, but potentially the deliberate actions of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate appearances. Friends and neighbors added depth to the investigators' understanding of Caylee's behavior. They described a woman who could appear cheerful and carefree one moment and evasive or anxious the next. Some noted her social activities while Caylee was missing, including nights out and casual engagements that seemed inconsistent with the urgency one would expect from a concerned parent. These accounts, combined with digital evidence, began to suggest a chilling narrative that challenged assumptions about maternal behavior and left investigators questioning whether what they were seeing was a calculated pattern or a disturbing lapse in judgment. Forensic findings continued to build a dark picture. Traces of chloroform in the car, combined with evidence from the home and digital searches, painted a scenario that demanded careful scrutiny. The investigators had to consider every possibility: accident, negligence, or deliberate harm. Each new revelation intensified the urgency of understanding the sequence of events, and investigators realized that solving the case would require not just facts, but insight into motives, behavior, and deception. Meanwhile, the media and public obsession reached unparalleled heights. News channels dissected interviews, replayed footage, and analyzed every gesture. Social media erupted with speculation and theories, from the mundane to the macabre. The narrative of a missing child intertwined with a mother's enigmatic behavior became a story that captivated the nation, drawing millions into a collective attempt to understand the inexplicable. By the 10th week, the investigation had reached a stage where every detail mattered, and the pressure on law enforcement was immense. Authorities had to consider the worst-case scenarios while maintaining focus on gathering evidence that could withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. Each inconsistency in Caylee Anthony's story became a focal point, from minor timeline errors to glaring contradictions about where Caylee had been and when. Detectives knew that unraveling these threads was key to understanding the truth. During this period, friends and acquaintances provided increasingly detailed accounts of Caylee's behavior. Some recounted evenings when she seemed completely unconcerned about her missing child, attending parties and social gatherings without hesitation. Others described moments where she appeared anxious, distracted, or evasive when asked about Caylee, giving rise to an unsettling sense of duality in her behavior. Investigators began to consider whether these actions were deliberate attempts to mislead or a reflection of a deeply troubling psychological state. Forensic examinations continued to uncover evidence that both baffled and alarmed the investigators. The traces of chloroform in Caylee's car, coupled with peculiar chemical residues in the home, indicated the potential for premeditation or concealment of a crime. Digital searches relating to harming children or disposing of a body added a chilling layer to the investigation. Experts debated whether these findings could be considered definitive evidence of intent, but in combination with Caylee's contradictory accounts, they suggested a pattern that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the case had become a force unto itself. 24-hour news cycles broadcast every detail of the investigation and interviews with family, friends, and neighbors. Social media users dissected body language, tone, and inconsistencies in Caylee's statements, speculating endlessly about motives and possible outcomes. Public opinion was split, with some convinced of Caylee's guilt and others hoping for her innocence, creating a nation divided and obsessed with the unfolding drama. Caylee Anthony's anguish continued to contrast sharply with Caylee's demeanor. She tirelessly searched for her granddaughter, pleading publicly for answers, while Caylee maintained a calm exterior that only deepened suspicion. The contrast between grief and apparent indifference became one of the most haunting aspects of the case, drawing investigators and the public alike deeper into the mystery. Every day without clarity added to the suspense, making the story of Caylee's disappearance one of the most gripping and disturbing in modern American history. By the 11th week, the case had reached a level of intensity that few could have anticipated. Investigators were now operating under the assumption that every detail, no matter how small, could be crucial to understanding what had happened to Caylee Anthony. The inconsistencies in Caylee's statements were dissected, compared against physical evidence, witness testimonies, and digital records. Every minor contradiction became a potential clue, and detectives worked tirelessly to reconstruct the events of the missing 31 days. Caylee's behavior continued to perplex authorities. On one hand, she appeared normal, engaging in social activities, talking casually with friends, and presenting an almost carefree exterior. On the other hand, small details revealed through witness accounts suggested evasiveness, rehearsed responses, and moments of detachment that were difficult to reconcile with the disappearance of her own child. Psychologists and behavioral experts began weighing in, analyzing her demeanor, her reactions, and the patterns in her statements, trying to understand whether they indicated guilt, fear, or a complex psychological defense mechanism. Forensic evidence kept investigators on edge. Traces of chemicals, suspicious residues, and digital searches relating to the harming and disposal of a child all contributed to a chilling narrative. Every new piece of evidence seemed to reinforce the possibility of deliberate harm, yet the exact details remained frustratingly elusive. Detectives knew that any misstep could jeopardize the case, making the painstaking collection and interpretation of evidence even more critical. Meanwhile, public interest had reached an unprecedented level. News channels analyzed every new development in real time, scrutinizing Caylee's body language, speech patterns, and interviews. Social media users speculated wildly, discussing potential motives, theories, and the moral implications of the case. Every update became a topic of national conversation, creating a sense of collective obsession with the tragedy. Caylee Anthony, the grandmother, continued her tireless search and public advocacy for her granddaughter. Her emotional appeals highlighted the stark contrast between her own anguish and Casey's enigmatic calm. This juxtaposition became one of the defining elements of the case, fueling both media coverage and public debate. Investigators, while immersed in the technical and forensic aspects of the investigation, could not ignore the psychological and social dimensions that made this case so uniquely captivating and so haunting. By the 12th week, the investigation had begun to converge on a chilling reality. Law enforcement now approached the case with the understanding that Caylee Anthony's disappearance might not be a simple matter of negligence or miscommunication. Every conflicting statement from Casey was scrutinized under the lens of possible intentional deception. Investigators retraced her steps meticulously, reconstructing the timeline day by day, hour by hour, using every shred of evidence: phone logs, receipts, witness testimonies, and even minute details reported by neighbors and friends. Friends described moments when Casey seemed unnervingly carefree, attending parties, laughing with acquaintances, and carrying on as if nothing had happened, while Caylee remained missing. Others noted subtle behavioral shifts, hesitations, vague responses, or sudden changes in tone that now seemed to suggest a deeper awareness of her involvement. Experts in behavioral psychology weighed in, analyzing her patterns of speech, her body language, and the contradictions in her stories, trying to determine whether they indicated guilt, fear, or a psychological defense mechanism designed to mask culpability. Forensic examinations continued to reveal increasingly troubling evidence. Chloroform residues, traces of unknown chemicals, and other suspicious materials raised questions about possible premeditation or attempts to conceal harm. Combined with disturbing internet search histories on methods of incapacitating or killing a child, investigators began piecing together a scenario far darker than any casual observer could have imagined. Each new discovery tightened the investigative focus, forcing detectives to consider the possibility of deliberate, planned actions. Public scrutiny reached fever pitch. News outlets ran continuous coverage, analyzing every gesture, every facial expression, every interview. Social media users debated motives, dissected timelines, and shared theories with obsessive detail. The nation was gripped, divided between those who were convinced of Casey's guilt and those still holding out hope for her innocence. This case had transcended the typical missing child story. It had become a psychological, social, and moral battleground. Caylee Anthony, meanwhile, remained a figure of relentless urgency and grief. Her public appeals, interviews, and personal outreach amplified the contrast between a desperate grandmother and a mother whose calm demeanor seemed almost surreal. This juxtaposition fueled not only media coverage, but also the investigators' growing realization. Understanding Casey's motives, behavior, and actions would be key to unraveling the mystery of Caylee's disappearance, and perhaps to preventing future tragedies of a similar nature. By the 13th week, the investigation had grown into a complex web of timelines, testimonies, and forensic evidence. Detectives were no longer simply looking for a missing child. They were piecing together a potential narrative of deception, concealment, and possibly foul play. Every small discrepancy in Caylee Anthony's story became critical. Investigators meticulously compared her statements against phone records, witness accounts, and receipts, hoping to identify patterns that could reveal what truly happened during those missing 31 days. Friends and neighbors provided increasingly detailed recollections of Casey's behavior. Some remembered casual social outings, parties, and dinners she attended, while Caylee remained unaccounted for, often behaving as if nothing had changed. Others reported moments of hesitation, vague explanations, or subtle signs of anxiety that now seemed significant in hindsight. These contradictions created a sense of duality in her behavior, a person capable of appearing normal and sociable while possibly harboring dark secrets. Forensic evidence continued to alarm investigators. Traces of chloroform in her vehicle, chemical residues found in various locations, and her digital search history pointing to methods of harming or disposing of a child all contributed to an increasingly chilling picture. While individually each element could be debated, together they formed a pattern too disturbing to ignore. Experts in criminology and psychology analyzed the evidence and the behavior, debating the possibility of premeditation versus accidental circumstances. Meanwhile, the nation remained riveted. Media outlets dissected every new development, replayed interviews, and analyzed Casey's facial expressions and speech patterns. Social media platforms exploded with speculation and discussion. The story had evolved from a missing child case into a cultural phenomenon, a national obsession that combined tragedy, mystery, and a fascination with the darkest corners of human behavior. Caylee Anthony's tireless efforts to locate her granddaughter continued to add urgency and emotion to the case. Her public appeals and heartfelt interviews contrasted sharply with Casey's detached demeanor, creating a narrative tension that captivated both investigators and the public. Each day that passed without clarity intensified the sense of suspense, leaving everyone, police, media, and citizens alike, wondering what had truly occurred behind the doors of the Anthony household. By the 14th week, the investigation had reached a point where the minutiae of Caylee Anthony's life were under microscopic examination. Detectives were working around the clock, analyzing every facet of her behavior, every interaction, and every timeline discrepancy. They retraced her steps with painstaking precision, hours spent mapping her daily movements, cross-referencing phone calls, credit card purchases, witness statements, and even seemingly trivial details such as trips to grocery stores or social gatherings. Every small inconsistency now carried the weight of potential significance. The duality of Casey's behavior continued to baffle everyone. Friends recounted moments when she laughed and socialized, seemingly unconcerned, while other times she displayed vague unease, hesitation, or evasiveness when questions about Caylee arose. Behavioral experts studied these patterns, considering the possibility that Caylee was consciously manipulating perceptions, concealing guilt behind an almost rehearsed composure, or operating under a psychological state that blurred the lines between indifference and deception. Forensics continued to reveal troubling evidence. Chloroform traces in her car, chemical residues in the home, and other suspicious materials suggested knowledge or intent beyond negligence. Digital searches for ways to harm a child or conceal a crime added an unsettling layer to the narrative. Each revelation tightened the noose of suspicion, forcing investigators to consider increasingly grim scenarios and to plan for potential legal challenges in case of prosecution. Meanwhile, the media storm showed no sign of abating. News outlets offered minute-by-minute updates, replayed interviews, and dissected every gesture and statement from Caylee. Social media users speculated endlessly about motives, timelines, and outcomes. The nation was captivated, split between outrage, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. This case had transformed into a cultural phenomenon, reflecting collective fears, moral judgments, and the fascination with human behavior in its darkest forms. Amidst the chaos, Caylee Anthony's resolve remained unwavering. Her grief, tireless search efforts, and public advocacy highlighted the stark contrast between a desperate grandmother and a mother whose behavior was enigmatic and unsettling. For investigators, understanding Caylee's mindset, her motives, her ability to deceive, and her behavior under scrutiny became just as critical as locating Caylee herself. Each day that passed only heightened the suspense, leaving everyone involved in the case caught in a tense web of uncertainty, fear, and anticipation. By the 15th week, the investigation had taken on an almost obsessive intensity. Detectives worked tirelessly, delving deeper into every detail of Caylee Anthony's life, relationships, and behavior. The 31 days Caylee had been missing were reconstructed with painstaking care, each hour examined for contradictions, clues, and possible motives. Police analyzed phone records, receipts, witness statements, and surveillance footage, looking for patterns that could shed light on what had truly happened. Every inconsistency, no matter how minor, was treated as potentially significant. Caylee's behavior remained a focal point of scrutiny. Friends and acquaintances provided increasingly detailed accounts of her actions during the missing period. Some described nights out, parties, and social gatherings she attended with ease and laughter, while others recalled moments of subtle anxiety or evasiveness when the topic of Caylee arose. Behavioral experts were consulted to interpret these patterns, debating whether her composure was a deliberate strategy, a psychological defense, or an alarming lack of maternal concern. The duality of her behavior created an aura of unease, leaving investigators and the public questioning her true intentions. Forensic findings continued to build a chilling narrative. Traces of chloroform in Caylee's car, unusual chemical residues in the home, and digital searches for methods of harming a child or concealing a body suggested knowledge and intent. While each piece of evidence on its own could be debated, taken together they painted a dark and troubling picture. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the events during Caylee's disappearance were deliberate rather than accidental, and every detail was carefully documented for potential use in court. Public fascination reached a fever pitch. News channels provided live coverage of each new development, replaying interviews and analyzing body language and speech patterns. Social media was abuzz with theories, accusations, and debates. The case had transcended the ordinary boundaries of a missing child story. It had become a national obsession, a reflection of society's fear, curiosity, and moral outrage. Every new piece of information was dissected, and the story continued to dominate the public consciousness. Caylee Anthony, meanwhile, remained a relentless presence. Her desperate appeals, public statements, and tireless search efforts highlighted the stark contrast between grief and composure, urgency and detachment. Investigators knew that understanding Caylee's behavior, her motives, lies, and possible deception, was as crucial as following the forensic trail. Each day that passed without resolution added tension, deepening the suspense and leaving the entire nation captivated by the unfolding mystery of Caylee Anthony's disappearance. By the 16th week, the investigation had transformed into a psychological and forensic maze. Authorities were now meticulously analyzing every facet of Caylee Anthony's behavior, searching for connections between her statements, actions, and the mounting evidence. Each hour of Caylee's disappearance was reconstructed in painstaking detail, cross-referencing phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage, and digital activity. Every small contradiction, every unexplained absence, and every vague explanation became a piece of a puzzle that seemed increasingly dark and complex. Friends and acquaintances provided increasingly detailed accounts of Caylee's behavior during the missing weeks. Some recounted evenings when she laughed and socialized without a hint of concern, attending parties and events as if her child's disappearance were irrelevant. Others noticed subtle signs of nervousness or evasion when she was asked about Caylee. Behavioral analysts were brought in to study these patterns, debating whether they indicated calculated deception, a psychological defense mechanism, or a profound disconnect from reality. The duality in Caylee's behavior created an unsettling tension, leaving investigators and the public alike to question what was truly happening behind closed doors. Forensic evidence continued to deepen the chilling picture. Traces of chloroform in her vehicle, unusual chemical residues in the home, and disturbing digital search histories pointing to methods of harming or disposing of a child suggested intent and knowledge that could not be ignored. Every new piece of information, no matter how small, was painstakingly documented, analyzed, and cross-referenced with Caylee's timeline and statements. Investigators knew that these details would be critical in understanding the sequence of events and preparing for the possibility of prosecution. Meanwhile, media coverage and public fascination reached unprecedented levels. News outlets broadcast every development live, replayed interviews, and analyzed every nuance of Caylee's words and body language. Social media users debated motives, timelines, and potential outcomes, creating an echo chamber of speculation, outrage, and morbid curiosity. The case had evolved from a missing child story into a national obsession, capturing the collective attention of millions who were desperate for answers. Caylee Anthony's tireless advocacy remained a poignant counterpoint to Caylee's enigmatic behavior. Her public appeals, interviews, and relentless search for her granddaughter highlighted the stark contrast between urgency, grief, and the apparent detachment of Caylee. Investigators understood that unraveling the psychological puzzle of Caylee's behavior was as critical as the forensic investigation itself, and every day that passed added layers of suspense, fear, and anticipation to a case that had already gripped an entire nation. By the 17th week, the investigation had reached a level of painstaking scrutiny rarely seen in missing child cases. Detectives were now operating with a sense of urgency matched only by the chilling complexity of the situation. Every statement from Caylee Anthony was dissected repeatedly, compared against forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and timelines painstakingly reconstructed from hours of phone records, receipts, and surveillance footage. Each minor inconsistency became a potential key to unraveling the truth behind Caylee's disappearance. Friends and acquaintances painted a portrait of Caylee that was deeply unsettling. Some recalled nights when she seemed utterly carefree, socializing, laughing, and engaging in activities that suggested life was proceeding normally despite her child's absence. Others remembered fleeting moments of hesitation, vague answers, or subtle signs of anxiety when questions about Caylee were raised. Behavioral experts studied these patterns closely, questioning whether this detachment reflected deliberate manipulation, a defense mechanism, or something far darker. The duality in her behavior, a mix of normalcy and unsettling detachment, kept both investigators and the public guessing. Forensic evidence added an increasingly disturbing layer to the narrative. Traces of chloroform in her vehicle, chemical residues in the home, and digital searches concerning harming and disposing of a child created a pattern of evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Each discovery reinforced the possibility that the events surrounding Caylee's disappearance were deliberate and calculated, rather than accidental or negligent. Investigators meticulously documented each finding, aware that every detail could be pivotal in court or in reconstructing the timeline of Caylee's final days. Meanwhile, media coverage and public obsession had reached a crescendo. News outlets analyzed every statement, facial expression, and body language cue from Caylee, while social media erupted with theories, speculation, and moral judgment. The nation was collectively engrossed, divided between outrage, disbelief, and a morbid fascination with the unfolding mystery. This story was no longer simply about a missing child. It had become a reflection of society's deepest fears and its obsession with human behavior at its most enigmatic. Amid the chaos, Caylee Anthony's relentless efforts to locate her granddaughter continued to add emotional intensity to the case. Her appeals, public statements, and tireless advocacy contrasted sharply with Caylee's calm, enigmatic presence. Investigators recognized that understanding Caylee's psychological state, the motives behind her words and actions, was as critical as analyzing forensic evidence. Each day without answers intensified the suspense, leaving the entire nation gripped by a story of deception, tragedy, and unanswered questions. By the 18th week, investigators had entered a phase where nothing could be overlooked. Every tiny detail, every minor contradiction in Caylee Anthony's statements, and every overlooked clue was now scrutinized with painstaking care. Detectives reconstructed the missing 31 days hour by hour, relying on phone records, receipts, witness accounts, and surveillance footage. Each element, no matter how small, could provide insight into what had truly happened during Caylee's disappearance. Friends and acquaintances continued to provide critical information. Some described Caylee attending parties, laughing, and engaging in social activities, as if Caylee's absence were inconsequential. Others noted subtle moments of anxiety, evasiveness, or inconsistent explanations when asked about her daughter. Behavioral analysts debated whether this was a calculated strategy, a psychological defense, or an unsettling lack of maternal concern. This duality of outward normalcy and subtle detachment created a psychological tension that fascinated and disturbed both investigators and the public. Forensic evidence intensified the gravity of the case. Chloroform traces in Caylee's car, chemical residues found in various locations, and disturbing internet searches about harming or concealing a child painted a chilling narrative. Each discovery, while potentially explainable on its own, contributed to an overall picture that suggested intentionality rather than accident. Investigators meticulously documented and cross-referenced every piece of evidence, knowing it could be pivotal in understanding the sequence of events and in future legal proceedings. Public attention remained relentless. Media outlets broadcast live updates, replayed interviews, and dissected Caylee's every gesture, expression, and word. Social media exploded with speculation, theory crafting, and moral debate, keeping the case at the forefront of national consciousness. The story had transcended a simple missing child case, becoming a nationwide obsession with psychological, social, and moral implications. Caylee Anthony's tireless advocacy continued to provide both urgency and emotional weight to the unfolding narrative. Her relentless search, public appeals, and visible grief highlighted the stark contrast between maternal despair and Caylee's enigmatic composure. Investigators realized that unraveling Caylee's psychological motives, behavioral patterns, and potential deception was just as crucial as the forensic investigation itself. Each passing day heightened the suspense, leaving the nation gripped by a case that had become a labyrinth of mystery, fear, and anticipation. By the 19th week, the case had begun to feel less like an investigation and more like a slow descent into something deeply unsettling. Detectives were no longer just searching for answers. They were confronting the possibility that the truth, whatever it was, would horrify the nation. The 31-day gap had become a black hole, swallowing logic, explanations, and excuses. Every version of events Caylee Anthony had offered was now layered over with doubt, contradiction, and silence. What stood out most wasn't just what she said, it was what she never said. No frantic calls, No desperate searches. No visible panic. Just time passing quietly. Investigators focused heavily on the psychology of delay. Why wait 31 days to report a missing child? Experts explain that delay in missing child cases often signals knowledge, not confusion, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that reporting earlier would have triggered questions the person wasn't ready to answer. The longer detectives studied Casey's behavior, the clearer one thing became. Her life during those 31 days did not resemble that of a mother searching for a lost child. It resembled someone protecting a secret. Friends began distancing themselves, some out of fear, others out of disbelief. Statements changed. Loyalties fractured. People who once defended Caylee now hesitated, recalling moments that suddenly felt wrong, her calm tone, her casual jokes, her ability to blend into normal life, while Caylee's absence hung in the air like a shadow no one wanted to name. Each recollection added emotional weight, not because it proved guilt, but because it reinforced a pattern of emotional disconnect that was impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, detectives debated scenarios late into the night. Accidental death, negligence, premeditation, cover-up. Each theory carried terrifying implications. Evidence was arranged and rearranged, timelines stretched and compressed, searching for a version of events that aligned with facts rather than feelings. But the facts were cold, and they didn't bend easily. The smell detected in the car, the trunk, the chemical traces, the internet searches. Each detail pressed harder against the walls of denial. Meanwhile, the public's patience was wearing thin. Sympathy was turning into anger. Candlelight vigils now carried tension instead of hope. Talk shows shifted tone, no longer asking asterisk where is Caylee, asterisk but asterisk what happened to her, asterisk the nation was no longer waiting for a miracle. It was bracing itself for a reckoning. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the noise, the speculation, the outrage, there was a 2-year-old child whose voice had been completely erased. No memories to defend herself. No words to explain her final days. Just absence. An absence that grew heavier with every passing week, pressing down on investigators, family members, and a country that could no longer look away. By the 20th week, the investigation crossed an invisible line, the moment when hope quietly steps aside and reality takes over. Detectives were no longer speaking in the language of rescue. Their tone had changed. Conversations shifted from asterisk finding asterisk Caylee to asterisk understanding asterisk her final days. It was a subtle shift, but a devastating one. When investigators stop asking where someone is and start asking how long they've been gone, the meaning is clear, even if no one says it out loud. Search efforts intensified, but not in the way the public expected. They weren't random anymore. They were targeted. Woods, wetlands, remote areas, places where silence stays undisturbed. Every search team member understood the weight of what they might find. Each step through tall grass, each rustle of leaves, carried the possibility of ending the mystery in the worst way imaginable. The air during these searches was heavy, almost reverent, as if everyone already knew the truth but feared confirming it. Caylee, meanwhile, remained an enigma. Her demeanor didn't shift with the gravity of the investigation. No visible breakdown. No public desperation. Psychologists observing from afar debated endlessly. Was this emotional numbness, denial, or something more calculated? In criminal cases, behavior doesn't always equal guilt, but patterns matter. And this pattern, the absence of visible grief, the lack of urgency, the contradictions layered over weeks, continued to deepen the sense that something fundamental was missing where maternal instinct should have been. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were beginning to think ahead. Evidence wasn't just being collected, it was being shaped into a narrative that could survive a courtroom. Because truth alone isn't enough in the justice system, it has to be proven, explained, and defended against doubt. Every piece of evidence was examined not just for what it suggested, but for how it could be challenged. Every assumption was questioned. Every theory stress-tested. Because once accusations are made, there's no turning back. Public opinion had now hardened. The country was divided, not on whether something terrible had happened, but on asterisk what kind asterisk of terrible it was. Accidental tragedy followed by panic, or intentional harm followed by deception. The divide was sharp, emotional, and relentless. Talk shows, radio segments, online forums, everywhere the same question echoed, reshaped, rephrased, but never answered. And at the center of it all was still silence. No sightings, no sounds, no trace of Caylee alive anywhere in the world. Just a timeline that refused to make sense, a mother whose words kept changing, and an investigation inching closer to a conclusion no one wanted, but everyone felt was coming. By the 21st week, silence finally broke, not with answers, but with a discovery that shifted the entire weight of the case. In a wooded area not far from the Anthony home, search teams uncovered remains. Small, fragile, almost swallowed by the landscape itself. The location wasn't dramatic or remote, and that's what made it more disturbing. This wasn't a place hidden with precision. It was a place overlooked, ignored, passed by countless times, as if whoever left Caylee there believed time, weather, and neglect would do the rest. When the news reached investigators, there was no celebration, no relief, only a quiet, devastating confirmation of what many had already feared. The search for a living child had ended. What remained was a question far heavier than location. Asterisk, how did this happen and why? Asterisk, forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every inch, every fragment, every environmental detail. In cases like this, even the soil tells a story, if you know how to listen. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Grief turned into outrage. Candlelight vigils transformed into expressions of anger and disbelief. A child had been missing for months, and her body was found close to home. Too close. That single fact alone shook people to their core. If she had been there all along, then the unanswered questions were no longer abstract. They were personal, accusatory, impossible to ignore. Caylee Anthony's response, or lack of one, only deepened the unease. No public collapse, no visible shock. Observers noted how moments that might break an innocent parent passed without emotional rupture. Again, experts cautioned restraint. People grieve differently. Trauma manifests in strange ways. But doubt had already taken root, and doubt, once planted, grows fast. For investigators, the case entered its most critical phase. Every prior statement Caylee had made was now re-examined under a harsher light. Timelines tightened. Theories narrowed. What once could be explained away as confusion now demanded accountability. This was no longer about speculation. It was about reconstructing a final sequence of events that could never be repeated, only inferred. Autopsy results would take time. Decomposition had erased many answers. Nature once again had done its quiet work, and that absence of clarity created a legal nightmare. Without a clear cause of death, the burden of proof would rest heavily on circumstantial evidence, behavior, deception, and patterns rather than direct explanation. The kind of case that divides juries. The kind that haunts prosecutors. And as the nation processed the reality of Caylee's death, one unsettling truth became impossible to escape. This story was no longer just about what happened to a child. It was about trust, about motherhood, about how easily appearances can deceive, and how long lies can survive before the truth finally surfaces, altered, incomplete, and devastating. By the 22nd week, the case shifted from investigation to confrontation. With Caylee's remains found, the question was no longer asterisk where asterisk. It was asterisk who asterisk and asterisk how asterisk. Prosecutors began assembling the story. They believed the evidence whispered rather than shouted. There was no single moment caught on camera. No eyewitness. No confession. What they had instead was a trail of behavior, choices made, lies repeated, time wasted, and they believed those choices told a story louder than any direct proof ever could. Caylee Anthony was arrested, and the moment marked a psychological turning point for the country. For some, it felt inevitable. For others, terrifying. Arrest doesn't mean guilt, but it does mean the state believes it can convince 12 strangers beyond reasonable doubt. And this case, it was fragile, built not on certainty, but on patterns. On what a mother did not do, on what she said that later collapsed, on what she searched where she went, and how easily she slipped into normal life while her daughter was vanishing from it. Interrogation footage resurfaced and spread like wildfire. People watched her smile, joke, and deflect. They watched detectives patiently peel away stories, the imaginary nanny, the fake workplace, the invented routines. Each lie wasn't just false, it was detailed, confident, and sustained. Investigators believed that kind of lying required rehearsal, not panic. But defense attorneys argued the opposite, that fear, immaturity, and dysfunction can drive people to fabricate realities when they feel cornered. The same behavior meant two completely different things, depending on which side you stood on. As pretrial hearings began, the courtroom became a theater of tension. Evidence was argued before it was even allowed to be shown. Every detail, duct tape, hair samples, computer searches, was fought over fiercely. The prosecution framed them as pieces of a deliberate act. The defense framed them as coincidence, contamination, or tragic misunderstanding. And hovering over it all was the absence of a clear cause of death, the one thing that could have ended debate instantly, but never would. Public opinion fractured completely. There was no middle ground anymore. Some believed the prosecution was stretching a weak case to satisfy public anger. Others believed no innocent mother could behave the way Caylee had. Families argued. Comment sections exploded. Friendships ended over debates about guilt and innocence. The case wasn't just dividing America. It was forcing people to confront what they believed about motherhood, responsibility, and how much behavior should matter when evidence is incomplete. And through it all, Caylee remained silent. Reduced to exhibits, photographs, timelines. Her short life discussed in legal language, stripped of warmth. The courtroom focused on adults, motives, narratives, while the smallest voice in the room could never speak again. That imbalance, that quiet injustice, settled deep into the collective conscience of the nation. The trial was coming, and with it a question no verdict could fully answer. When truth is buried by time, decay, and deception, how close can justice ever really get? By the 23rd week, the trial began, and with it, the country stopped breathing in unison. Courtrooms are usually quiet places, but this one carried a different kind of silence. Heavy, watchful, every footstep echoed. Every pause felt intentional. 12 jurors took their seats, unaware that their lives would never return to normal again. What they were about to hear would follow them long after the verdict, no matter what that verdict would be. The prosecution opened by framing the case as one of betrayal, not just of a child, but of trust itself. They spoke of the 31 days, the lies, the absence of panic. They didn't rely on emotion alone. They relied on repetition. Day after day, they laid out how Caylee's stories shifted, how each version contradicted the last, how fictional people and places appeared and vanished as needed. To them, this wasn't confusion. It was construction, a carefully built alternate reality designed to delay the inevitable. The defense countered with a radically different portrait. They painted Caylee as immature, dysfunctional, emotionally stunted, a young woman raised in chaos, incapable of coping with crisis. They suggested accidental death, family secrecy, panic-driven deception. They argued that lies do not equal murder, that odd behavior does not equal intent, that the state was asking jurors to fill in gaps with assumptions, and assumptions are not proof. In their version, this was a tragic accident made worse by fear and silence. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Friends, family, forensic experts, law enforcement officers. Each testimony added weight, but also confusion. One expert said the evidence suggested one thing. Another said it suggested nothing conclusive at all. Jurors watched as certainty dissolved into interpretation. Science blurred into probability. Facts leaned heavily on context, and context, once questioned, becomes unstable. The duct tape became a symbol. To the prosecution, it was sinister. To the defense, it was unprovable in purpose. The computer searches sparked outrage, but were they intentional or misunderstood? Even the smell in the car became a battleground of expert opinion. The courtroom wasn't searching for truth anymore. It was weighing plausibility. And that distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some held signs demanding justice. Others warned against conviction without proof. News vans lined the streets. Commentators spoke with confidence, even when the case itself offered none. America wasn't just watching a trial, it was participating in it, emotionally invested, deeply divided, and convinced that their interpretation was the only reasonable one. And at the center of it all sat Caylee Anthony, expression controlled, posture steady, eyes forward. Some saw coldness, others saw fear. The same face reflected completely different truths, depending on who was looking. That was the most unsettling part of all. As the trial stretched on, one realization slowly set in: this case would not end cleanly. No matter the verdict, half the country would feel betrayed. And somewhere beneath the legal arguments, media noise, and public outrage, one question refused to disappear: not what the jury would decide, but whether anyone would ever truly know what happened in those final moments of a child's life. By the 24th week, the trial had reached a point where tension replaced logic. Jurors were no longer just listening, they were enduring. Hours of testimony blurred together, and certainty became exhausting. The prosecution leaned harder on behavior, returning again and again to the same haunting question. What kind of mother doesn't report her child missing for 31 days? They repeated it in different words, different tones, different moments, hoping it would lodge itself somewhere deep in the jurors' minds. Not as accusation, but as inevitability. The defense, sensing the emotional weight tipping dangerously, pushed back with equal force. They reminded the jury that criminal court is not a morality contest, that bad parenting is not a capital crime, that people lie for many reasons: fear, shame, control, and not all of them involve murder. They warned against letting emotion replace evidence, against punishing someone for being unlikable, against assuming that silence equals guilt. Their message was clear: if the story doesn't prove itself, it doesn't matter how disturbing it feels. Cindy and George Anthony's testimonies added another layer of discomfort. Family dynamics spilled into public view: dysfunction, denial, control, blame. The idea that something terrible could happen inside a home without anyone fully acknowledging it unsettled the jury and the nation alike. The defense hinted at buried family secrets. The prosecution rejected those hints as distraction. But once the idea was planted, it couldn't be removed. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about Caylee. It was about what families hide and how far denial can stretch. As closing arguments approached, fatigue set in. Jurors weren't asking which side was right, they were asking which side had proven enough. That distinction mattered. The burden didn't rest on Caylee to explain everything. It rested on the state to explain everything beyond doubt. And doubt was everywhere. In the science, in the timelines, in the interpretations, even in the emotions themselves. Outside, the nation argued louder than ever. Some were already calling her guilty, convinced no verdict could change their minds. Others feared the precedent, that behavior alone could condemn someone without a clear cause of death. The case had stopped being about Caylee alone. It had become a mirror, forcing people to confront how they define guilt when certainty is impossible. When the jury finally left to deliberate, the courtroom felt hollow. Empty benches, still air, weeks of testimony reduced to silence. And in that silence lived the most terrifying truth of all. The outcome would not be decided by what felt true, but by what could be proven and what could not. Somewhere, the weight of that decision pressed down on 12 ordinary people, locked in a room, holding a verdict that would echo for years. By the 25th week, the verdict arrived, not with thunder, but with a quiet that felt unreal. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air tightened. No one breathed normally. Cameras zoomed. Hands clenched. The words that followed didn't explode, they sank. Not guilty. One count after another. The courtroom didn't erupt, it fractured. Gasps, whispers, disbelief moving through the room like a cold current. For a moment, it felt as if reality itself had misfired. Outside, the reaction was instant and volcanic. Anger spilled into the streets. People screamed at screens. Some cried. Some laughed in disbelief. Others stood frozen, trying to understand how months of evidence, emotion, and national obsession had ended this way. To many, it felt like justice had slipped through a technical crack, not because innocence was proven, but because certainty was never achieved. The difference mattered legally. Emotionally, it felt unbearable. Legal experts explained what the jury had done, not declared innocence, but rejected proof beyond reasonable doubt. No cause of death. No direct evidence. Too many gaps. Too much interpretation. The law demands precision, not intuition. And the jury, bound by that rule, chose doubt over assumption. But for the public, that explanation felt hollow. Because some cases don't collapse under logic, they collapse under silence. Caylee Anthony walked free. Cameras followed every step. her expression unreadable. Some saw relief. Others saw emptiness. To supporters, she had survived a system hungry for blame. To critics, she had escaped accountability. Both sides believed they were witnessing a failure, just of different kinds. And that unresolved tension ensured the case would never rest. In the months that followed, the story refused to fade. Documentaries, interviews, re-examinations, everyone searching for the missing piece that might finally make it make sense. But time doesn't restore erased truths. It only sharpens questions. Caylee's death remained legally unexplained, emotionally undeniable, and permanently suspended between narratives. What lingered most wasn't the verdict, it was the absence. The absence of answers. The absence of closure. A child lost. A mother free. A nation divided not by facts, but by belief. And perhaps that is why this case never truly ended, because it forced people to confront something deeply uncomfortable, that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive cleanly, and justice, bound by rules, can only go as far as certainty allows. And somewhere beneath all the noise, one small life remained the quiet center of a storm that still hasn't fully settled. Years passed, but this case never aged. It didn't soften. It didn't fade into archives the way most trials do. Instead, it stayed sharp, reopening itself every time someone whispered Caylee's name. By the 26th phase of this story, time had done something strange. It had closed the courtroom, but widened the wound. Caylee Anthony disappeared from public view, but the questions followed her everywhere, not shouted anymore, just quietly present, like something unfinished sitting in the back of the mind. People replayed the same moments again and again. The 31 days. The lies that came too easily. The calm that felt out of place. Others replayed the weaknesses, the lack of a cause of death, the contamination, the assumptions layered over science. Two truths existed side by side, unable to cancel each other out. One said asterisk, she did it asterisk. The other said asterisk, you can't prove she did asterisk. And the justice system, bound by rules, chose the only option it legally could. But legality doesn't satisfy grief. It doesn't quiet instinct. It doesn't answer why a child vanished while the world kept spinning. Caylee became something larger than a victim. She became a symbol of lost innocence, of how fragile truth can be when time erases evidence, of how behavior can scream while facts stay silent. Parents hugged their children tighter after hearing her story. Investigators used the case as a warning about delays, about lies, about how quickly reality can fracture when fear takes control. But none of those lessons brought her back. Every documentary promised clarity. Every interview teased revelation. And every time the same ending arrived, more questions, rearranged but never resolved. That's the cruelty of this case. It offers just enough information to feel certain, and just enough uncertainty to make that certainty collapse. And maybe that's why it still haunts people. Because it forces an impossible confrontation. Sometimes, knowing asterisk something terrible happened asterisk is not the same as knowing asterisk what happened asterisk. Sometimes the truth doesn't leave fingerprints. Sometimes justice isn't defeated, it's limited. Somewhere beyond verdicts, beyond opinions, beyond headlines, a 2-year-old child remains at the center of it all, not as evidence, not as argument, but as absence. And that absence still echoes, quietly, relentlessly, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even now, the story refuses to close its eyes. Long after the verdict, long after the cameras packed up, the case continues to live in a strange afterlife, one where facts are frozen, but interpretations keep evolving. New generations discover it not as breaking news, but as a whispered legend of modern crime. Late at night, through headphones, through quiet rooms, through voices telling the story slowly, deliberately, the same unease returns. Because this isn't a case that shocks with violence. It disturbs with asterisk absence, asterisk. With what didn't happen. With what should have happened, but didn't. People still ask the same questions, but now they ask them softly. What happened during those 31 days when the world didn't know Caylee was gone? What was said behind closed doors? What was decided in moments no one will ever witness? Silence becomes the most terrifying character in the story, a silence that stretches from the day she vanished to this very moment. No confession has ever filled it. No new evidence has ever pierced it. Just time passing, carrying the unanswered forward. Caylee Anthony's name remains radioactive. Mention it and reactions still ignite. Some speak with certainty, others with caution, but no one speaks comfortably. That discomfort is the legacy of this case. It taught people that the justice system is not designed to heal, it is designed to decide. And sometimes deciding means letting uncertainty walk free while truth stays locked away, incomplete and unreachable. Caylee, meanwhile, never got a story of her own. Only fragments told by others. A child remembered through courtroom exhibits, photographs, and theories. Her laughter imagined. Her fear unknown. Her final moments forever sealed in a timeline that stops before it explains itself. That is what makes this case linger, not the crime itself, but the fact that the most important voice was never heard. And so the case lives on, not as a closed file, but as a quiet disturbance in the collective memory. A reminder that some mysteries don't end, they simply stop progressing. They sit with us. They wait. They resurface in the stillness, when distractions fade and the mind wanders back to the same unsettling thought. Sometimes, the most frightening stories are not the ones with answers, but the ones that leave us alone with questions. The case didn't end, it settled like dust after an explosion, invisible but everywhere. In the years that followed, investigators, psychologists, journalists, and ordinary people kept circling the same quiet center, trying to understand how a child could disappear in plain sight. Training manuals quietly changed. Missing child protocols were rewritten. Officers were taught to treat delay itself as evidence, not an inconvenience. But none of that was announced loudly. There were no banners saying "we learned." The system adjusted silently, the way institutions do when they don't want to admit they failed. Late at night, retired detectives still spoke about the case in low voices. Not on records, not for documentaries, just between people who had seen too much. They talked about how lies, when told calmly enough, can buy time. About how time destroys evidence better than any fire ever could. About how a case can feel solved emotionally while remaining legally untouchable. Some admitted the hardest part wasn't losing in court. It was knowing they would never be able to explain Caylee's last moments to anyone. Not to the public. Not to themselves. The public obsession shifted shape. It became quieter, darker, more reflective. People didn't argue as loudly anymore, they listened. Crime podcasts dissected tone instead of timelines. Body language instead of facts. Silence instead of statements. The case became a blueprint for a new kind of storytelling, not about who did it but about how uncertainty survives about how ordinary settings, a home, a car, a backyard, can become unknowable once truth slips past them. And always those 31 days returned. Like a locked room no one could enter. Every theory eventually ran into that wall. Something happened there. Something irreversible. Something final. But time had erased the footprints, rain had washed away the ground, and lies had rearranged memory. What remained wasn't a story, it was a gap. A void shaped exactly like a child who should have been missed sooner. Sometimes people ask why this case still feels unfinished. It's not because there was no verdict. It's because nothing ever replaced the silence. No explanation filled it. No truth softened it. The case didn't give answers, it took certainty away. And once certainty is gone, it doesn't come back easily. So the story continues, not forward, but inward. In quiet rooms. In long drives. In late hours when the world is still and the mind drifts back to the same unsettling thought that somewhere, in the space between law and truth, a child vanished, and the echo of that absence never really stopped. Time moved on, but unease stayed exactly where it was. The case slipped into something colder than outrage, normalization. It became that case everyone knows discussed the way people discuss storms that already passed but destroyed too much to forget. New crimes emerged, louder, bloodier, easier to explain. Yet this one stayed different. It didn't scream. It lingered, because nothing about it fit the human instinct for resolution. No confessions surfaced. No hidden evidence appeared years later. No deathbed truths. Just a long, quiet stretch of nothing, and sometimes, nothing is the most disturbing outcome of all. Psychologists began referencing the case in a different way. Not as a crime study, but as a lesson in cognitive dissonance. How the human brain struggles when behavior feels wrong, but proof refuses to align. How people crave moral clarity more than factual certainty. How discomfort grows when intuition and law move in opposite directions. This case forced millions to sit inside that discomfort without relief, and many never left it. For some, the story became personal. Parents imagined the routines, bedtime, playtime, the ordinary moments that should have filled those missing days. Investigators imagined the decision points, the moment when one choice could have changed everything, when truth could have entered before lies sealed the door. Ordinary people imagined themselves in the timeline, asking what they would have noticed, what they would have questioned sooner, what silence they might have mistaken for normal. And that's where the case became dangerous in a different way. It crept into the everyday. It taught people that evil doesn't always announce itself, that neglect doesn't always look like cruelty, that lies don't always sound panicked. Sometimes they sound practiced, calm, almost believable. It made people look twice at delays, at inconsistencies, at moments when concern should exist but doesn't. Still, nothing changed the core truth. Caylee never got justice in a form that feels complete. She got a verdict, not an explanation. A legal ending, not a human one. Her story exists now only through reconstruction, speculation, and memory, a life defined not by how it was lived, but by how it disappeared. And perhaps that's why this case continues to whisper instead of shout. Because it doesn't ask you to react, it asks you to sit with it, to feel the weight of unanswered time, to realize that sometimes the most haunting stories don't end with a revelation. They end with a pause that never quite resolves, no matter how many years pass. And even that pause began to feel permanent. The case entered a strange kind of stillness, not closure, not forgetting, but suspension. Like a question left on the table long after everyone has stopped arguing about it. People stopped expecting answers. That, more than anything, marked the final transformation of the story. When hope for truth quietly exits, what remains is something colder, acceptance of uncertainty. Not peace, just resignation. Those who followed the case closely noticed how language around it changed over time. Early on, people said asterisk justice will come asterisk. Later, they said asterisk justice failed asterisk. Eventually, they stopped using the word justice at all. They spoke instead about systems, limits, human error, probability. The emotional core hardened into analysis. But analysis doesn't heal. It just explains why healing didn't happen. Somewhere along the way, Caylee became almost mythic, not in scale, but in symbolism. She represented every child whose story depends entirely on adults telling the truth. Every case where delay becomes destiny. Every moment when inaction causes damage just as surely as violence. And because her story lacked a definitive ending, people projected their own fears into it. Fear of failing someone who depends on you. Fear of being unable to prove what you know in your bones. Fear that truth, if left unattended long enough, simply dissolves. The most unsettling part is how ordinary everything still feels around it. The house, the street, the routines. Nothing about the setting screams tragedy. And that normality is what keeps the case alive. Because it suggests this didn't happen in a hidden corner of the world. It happened in a place that looked like thousands of others. A reminder that the line between safety and catastrophe isn't dramatic. It's thin, quiet, and often crossed without witnesses. So the story remains not unfinished, but unresolved. There's a difference. Unfinished stories still move forward. Unresolved ones stay exactly where they are, waiting for something that will never arrive. And this case sits there permanently, asking nothing, explaining nothing, but never leaving. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't demand outrage. It simply waits in the background of collective memory, reminding anyone who listens closely that sometimes the most disturbing truth is not what we don't know, but that we may never know it at all. And in that waiting, something subtle happens to the listener. The story stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a presence. Not loud, not dramatic, just there, like a room you once entered and never fully left. People who revisit the case years later often describe the same sensation, a slow tightening in the chest, a quiet frustration that has nowhere to go. Not anger and remorse, not shock, just the discomfort of knowing that some truths don't surface, no matter how much light you shine. The case becomes a test of patience, of belief, of how much ambiguity a person can tolerate. Some listeners lean towards certainty because uncertainty is unbearable. Others cling to doubt because certainty without proof feels dangerous. Neither side ever fully wins, and that stalemate is the final shape of the story. It doesn't resolve into a lesson. It doesn't wrap itself neatly. It just stays open, like an unanswered voicemail you can't delete. Late at night, when the world goes quiet, this is the kind of story that creeps back in. Not because it's violent, but because it's incomplete. Because the mind keeps returning to those missing hours, those missing reactions, those missing instincts. The imagination fills the gaps whether you want it to or not. And once it does, the case stops belonging to the courtroom or the media. It belongs to the listener. That's why it still works as a whisper. Because whispers require closeness. They pull you in. They don't explain, they imply. And this case is built entirely on implication. On what should have happened. On what didn't. On what was said too late or not at all. Some stories end with answers. Some end with justice. This one ends with awareness. The awareness that silence can be louder than screams, that delay can be more destructive than action, and that truth, once buried deep enough, doesn't always want to be found. And so the story remains, not moving forward, not fading away, just existing in that narrow space between knowing and never knowing, where the quiet is heavy, and the questions never stop forming. At some point, even the echoes grow tired, but they don't disappear. They just change texture. The case settles into memory the way an old scar settles into skin, no longer raw, but always felt when pressed. People stop arguing about guilt and innocence and start asking something quieter, more unsettling. Asterisk, what does this case say about us? Asterisk, about how easily we accept explanations when they're convenient. About how long we're willing to look away when discomfort demands attention. About how silence can stretch for 31 days and still be explained as confusion, fear, or immaturity, until it's too late to matter. The story becomes less about Caylee Anthony and more about the space around her. The empty spaces. The missed alarms. The moments where intervention could have entered but didn't. In hindsight, those gaps feel obvious. In real time, they never do. That's the uncomfortable truth people slowly realize. Most tragedies don't arrive announced. They arrive disguised as normal days, normal delays, normal excuses. And by the time clarity shows up, it's usually standing over something irreversible. Listeners begin to notice how the case mirrors real life in disturbing ways. How often people ignore inconsistencies because confronting them feels impolite. How often concern is postponed because certainty hasn't arrived yet. How often maybe later quietly becomes never. The Anthony case doesn't teach this loudly. It teaches it passively, by letting the absence speak. By letting time do what time always does when truth isn't protected, it erases. And still, Caylee remains the quiet center. Not frozen in photographs anymore, but suspended in imagination. A life that should have expanded into memory, instead reduced to speculation. Her presence is felt not through detail, but through loss, the loss of knowing, the loss of certainty, the loss of a story that could have been simple but became impossibly complex. This is why the case never closes in the mind, because it offers no release. No final image that explains everything. No sentence that settles the weight. Just a long corridor of unanswered moments, stretching backward and forward at the same time. And as long as people continue to listen, late at night, alone, letting the story unfold slowly in their ears, the case will keep whispering. Not demanding judgment. Not asking belief. Just reminding anyone willing to stay with the silence that some truths don't vanish. They just learn how to hide inside time. Eventually, the story reaches a place where even interpretation feels exhausted, where every angle has been turned over so many times that the edges are worn smooth. And yet the discomfort remains. Because what lingers isn't confusion anymore, it's recognition. Recognition that this case reflects something deeply human and deeply unsettling. Our tendency to wait for certainty before we act, even when urgency is screaming quietly in the background. People who revisit the case after years often notice a shift in themselves. They're less interested in asterisk, who asterisk did what, and more troubled by asterisk, how long nothing happened asterisk. How 31 days could pass without alarms, sounding loud enough to stop the ordinary flow of life. How routine can continue even when something essential is missing. That realization lands slowly, and when it does, it's heavier than outrage. because it suggests that tragedy doesn't always require cruelty. Sometimes it only requires delay. The case becomes a meditation on time, on how time can be weaponized without anyone intending to wield it. Every hour that passed without a report, every night that came and went without a search, every explanation that postponed confrontation just a little longer. Time didn't just move forward, it closed doors. It softened evidence. It blurred memories. It created a reality where truth became harder to prove with each passing day. And once that threshold is crossed, there is no rewind. In that sense, the most frightening aspect of the story isn't the crime itself, it's the invisibility of the turning point. No single moment announces itself as the point of no return. It's only in hindsight that the line becomes visible. And by then, it's already behind you. That's what makes this case resonate beyond headlines and verdicts. It doesn't feel exceptional. It feels uncomfortably possible. Caylee's story, stripped of spectacle, becomes painfully simple. A child depended on adults to speak, to act, to interrupt silence, and that interruption never came in time. Everything else is aftermath. Courtrooms, debates, documentaries. All of it exists because one essential moment passed unnoticed. And so the case doesn't ask listeners to decide guilt. It asks something harder. It asks them to sit with the idea that certainty is not always a prerequisite for responsibility. That sometimes waiting to be sure is the very thing that ensures we arrive too late. That's the final weight this story leaves behind. Not an answer, not a conclusion, but a quiet pressure on the mind. A reminder that when silence stretches long enough, it doesn't just hide the truth, it reshapes it. And when that pressure settles in, it doesn't push outward, it turns inward. The story stops pointing fingers and starts holding up a mirror. Listeners realize this case isn't haunting because it was extreme. It's haunting because it was ordinary. No masked intruder, no dramatic chase, no clear villain stepping out of the shadows. Just familiar rooms, familiar routines, familiar excuses. The kind that exist in countless homes, unnoticed, unquestioned, until something irreversible happens. That's why this case refuses to stay in the past. Because it never belonged there. It lives in the present tense, in every moment when concern is postponed, when doubt is silenced by convenience, when uncomfortable questions are avoided because asking them would disrupt normal life. The story whispers that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like calm. Sometimes it looks like control. Sometimes it looks like nothing at all. Over time, even the outrage transforms into something quieter, a low, persistent unease. Not about this case specifically, but about the fragile systems we rely on. About how truth depends on timing. About how protection depends on intervention. About how easily responsibility dissolves when everyone assumes someone else will speak first. The Anthony case doesn't accuse, it exposes that hesitation. Caylee's name, spoken now, carries a different weight. Not just sorrow, but warning. A reminder that childhood is entirely dependent on adult action, on vigilance, on interruption. And when those fail, the aftermath stretches far beyond a single family or courtroom. It seeps into culture, into policy, into how stories are told in hushed voices late at night. This is why the story still works as a long-form whisper. It doesn't rush. It doesn't resolve. It slowly guides the listener to a place where the real discomfort lives, not in speculation, but in recognition. Recognition that certainty is rare, but responsibility is constant. That waiting for perfect clarity is often a luxury time doesn't allow. And so the case settles into its final form, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a silence to be understood. A silence shaped like missed moments, delayed action, and a truth that slipped away while the world kept moving. The whisper doesn't ask for judgment. It doesn't ask for belief. It simply stays, reminding anyone who listens long enough that some stories don't end because they were never meant to. They exist to linger and to be felt. And even after decades, the story continues to echo in unexpected ways. It doesn't exist in headlines anymore. It doesn't appear in daily news cycles. It exists in memory, in imagination, in the quiet moments when the mind turns inward and asks uncomfortable questions. What would I have done in those 31 days? Would I have noticed the warning signs? Would I have acted differently? That's the lingering power of the case. It turns passive observers into participants, challenging anyone who hears it to confront their own assumptions about responsibility, urgency, and human behavior. Scholars and true crime enthusiasts dissect it endlessly. They study timelines, psychological profiles, family dynamics, and societal responses. But no matter how much analysis is done, the core truth remains unreachable. The missing child's final experiences, her thoughts, her fear, are forever unknowable. All that remains is a void filled by speculation, reflection, and uneasy awareness. And that void is what keeps the story alive, not sensationalism, not courtroom drama, but the haunting reminder that some tragedies are defined more by absence than presence. The impact of the case also ripples through culture. Crime shows reference it as an example of delay and deception. Podcasts use it to illustrate how silence can be deadly. Parenting guides, social commentaries, and legal studies cite it as a cautionary tale of inaction and the devastating weight of unreported crises. And yet, despite all the lessons, the emotional heart of the story is irretrievable. Caylee's voice never returns. Her presence is reconstructed, imagined, and mourned. Listeners who encounter the story years later still feel the same tension. The calm that masks danger, the delay that destroys possibility, the void left by what was never done. That tension doesn't dissipate with time. It compounds as each reflection reminds us that tragedy often creeps forward silently, unseen, until it is too late. And in that silence, in that stillness, the story lives on. Not as entertainment, not as gossip, not as historical record, but as a quiet, persistent reflection on the fragility of life, the importance of timely action, and the unsettling truth that some questions never find answers. Over the years, the case has taken on a life beyond the courtroom, beyond news articles, beyond documentaries. It has become a study in human behavior, not just the behavior of one mother, but of a society watching, judging, and trying to make sense of incomprehensible absence. People examine every choice, every delay, every contradiction, not because they expect to find definitive answers, but because they are searching for patterns, for understanding, for some grasp of how tragedy can unfold quietly in everyday life. The story has taught listeners a subtle, chilling lesson, that sometimes the most horrifying crimes are not those that shock at first glance, but those that hide in plain sight, unnoticed, for weeks, months, or even years. That danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it waits, patiently, invisibly, until the world realizes it was there all along. Even today, experts reference the Anthony case when discussing delayed reporting, family dysfunction, and forensic challenges. They highlight how gaps in action and attention can escalate consequences. But beyond the professional analysis lies the emotional truth that the public carries, the sense of disbelief, of frustration, and of sorrow for a life taken far too early. That emotional residue persists, quietly shaping how people perceive not just crime, but responsibility, vigilance, and human connection. For the listeners who follow this story in audio form, the power lies in its quiet horror. It doesn't rely on graphic imagery or shocking moments. It relies on tension, on the slow, almost imperceptible unfolding of inaction and deceit. It relies on the uncomfortable awareness that tragedy is not always loud, that justice is not always clear, and that sometimes the most devastating events are defined by what is missing, not by what is present. And so the story remains alive in memory and in reflection. It whispers through late-night listening, through careful storytelling, through the quiet contemplation of human nature. Caylee Anthony may never speak for herself, but her absence speaks endlessly to listeners, to investigators, to society at large, a reminder that some stories do not conclude with certainty. They linger, they teach, they haunt, and as the years stretch further, the story takes on an almost timeless quality. It exists not only in legal records or media archives, but in the collective consciousness of anyone who has considered the fragility of human life, the consequences of inaction, and the uncomfortable truths that emerge when ordinary routines intersect with tragedy. Listeners realize that the horror of this case is not limited to the courtroom or the media spectacle. It resides in the quiet spaces between decisions, in the pauses where intervention could have occurred but didn't. Parents, guardians, and ordinary citizens alike find themselves reflecting, what would I have noticed? What would I have done differently? That self-reflection, subtle as it is perhaps the most enduring impact of the story. It reminds us that vigilance, empathy, and action are not just moral imperatives. They are the thin lines that can prevent unimaginable loss. And yet, it also reminds us how easy it is to fail, even unintentionally, when assumptions replace attention and convenience replaces urgency. In criminal psychology circles, the Anthony case is often cited as a study in behavioral interpretation, delayed reporting, and parental detachment. But beyond the textbooks and expert analyses, it persists in the more personal, private realm of the mind. People replay it quietly, imagining scenarios, analyzing timelines, pondering decisions that led to irreversible outcomes. The tension is internalized, transforming the story from a public crime into a private meditation on responsibility and human nature. Even in storytelling, in podcasts, and in whispered retellings, the power of the case lies in its restraint. There is no sensational violence, no dramatic climax, just a slow unraveling of certainty, trust, and timing. It's the quiet unraveling that grips listeners, that makes the hours feel heavy, and that leaves a lingering unease long after the story ends. And so, for those who listen, who reflect, who sit with the tension of missing moments and unanswered questions, the story never truly ends. Caylee's absence continues to speak, hauntingly, insistently, a silent witness to the fragile boundaries between attention and neglect, certainty and doubt, presence and void. It whispers that some truths are too fragile to survive intact, and that the echoes of loss can outlast every verdict, every theory, and every attempt at explanation. Over time, the Anthony case transforms from a single story into a broader meditation on human vulnerability. It ceases to be only about one child, one family, or one trial. Instead, it becomes a lens through which listeners examine society, responsibility, and the consequences of inaction. It asks quietly but insistently, how often do we overlook warning signs? How often do we assume someone else will act? How often do delays, hesitation, and silence quietly reshape outcomes we can never undo? For many, the story becomes deeply personal. Parents imagine the ordinary moments, the bedtime routines, the playtime, the mundane household decisions, turning into points of potential intervention. They see themselves in the gaps, asking whether they would have noticed sooner, acted differently, spoken up when it mattered. That reflection is uncomfortable, unsettling, and yet strangely instructive, embedding the case in memory not as a spectacle, but as a warning. Criminal justice professionals revisit the case repeatedly, analyzing behavior, timelines, and forensic challenges. The gaps in evidence, the contradictions in testimony, and the absence of a clear cause of death make it a case study in how the law handles uncertainty. But even in the most technical analyses, the human element, the silence, the inaction, the missed opportunities, remains the most compelling, haunting factor. Listeners who experience the story as a long-form audio narrative feel this tension amplified. There is no rush, no dramatic peaks and valleys. Instead, the story unfolds slowly, deliberately, each pause, each hesitation, each reflection layering uncertainty and dread. By the end, what remains is not merely a crime, but an immersive experience of the fragility of human awareness and the devastating weight of delayed action. And so, the story lingers indefinitely, not because it seeks to shock, but because it resonates. It occupies the quiet spaces of thought, the reflective moments when the mind turns inward. It reminds listeners over and over that absence speaks as loudly as presence, that silence can be fatal, and that the true horror of some stories is not in what happens, but in what is left unsaid, unacted upon, and unresolved. As the story continues to echo through time, its power lies in persistence rather than spectacle. There are no sudden twists, no climactic revelations. Instead, the tension is slow, methodical, and psychological. Listeners begin to understand that the true horror isn't just the disappearance of Caylee Anthony, but the quiet, almost imperceptible ways in which inaction, delay, and deception compounded tragedy. Every lie told, every day that passed without intervention, every hesitation became a silent participant in the story. The more the narrative unfolds, the more it forces introspection. Listeners are drawn not just to the events, but to the human psychology behind them. What drives someone to fabricate stories? How does fear, shame, or immaturity distort decisions? How does a society, obsessed with morality yet constrained by law, interpret behavior without certainty? These questions linger, unanswered, creating a subtle, pervasive tension that doesn't resolve with the courtroom verdict. The case also teaches a more universal lesson: the fragility of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in social networks, trust in the ordinary moments of daily life. It shows how easily assumptions and neglect can allow small problems to escalate into irreparable outcomes. Caylee's absence becomes symbolic, not merely of one child lost, but of every moment when vigilance fails, when intervention is delayed, when silence replaces action. In long-form audio retellings, this tension is magnified. The story moves slowly, deliberately, drawing the listener into the psychological landscape of delay, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity. Each pause, each repeated detail, each unresolved question creates space for reflection and unease. By the time the narrative reaches its end, it leaves more than a memory. It leaves a quiet, lingering sense of responsibility and discomfort, a reminder that human lives depend on attentiveness, timely action, and honesty. And so, even years later, the story continues to haunt. Not with sensationalism, not with violence, but with the profound, unsettling realization that some tragedies are defined not by what happens, but by what is left undone. Caylee's absence continues to speak, quietly and relentlessly, to anyone who listens closely enough to hear it. As the story stretches further into the present, it becomes almost a meditation on inevitability. Listeners come to realize that this is not a tale of shocking twists or spectacular crime scenes. It is a study in the small, cumulative effects of choices, inattention, and human fallibility. Every moment that went unobserved, every lie that went unchecked, every hesitation that delayed action contributed to an outcome that could never be undone. The horror is quiet, intimate, and inescapable. This narrative forces reflection on human behavior in ways few other true crime stories do. It examines how fear, shame, and denial can warp perception, how the ordinary, mundane aspects of life, routine, distraction, assumption, can obscure urgency, how societal norms sometimes encourage looking away, waiting for proof, or deferring responsibility. In the Anthony case, these factors converged, producing a tragic and permanent silence that cannot be explained by evidence alone. For listeners engaging with the story as a long-form audio experience, this slow burn of tension creates a unique psychological immersion. Each pause, each repeated detail, each reference to the 31 missing days strengthens a sense of unresolved dread. There is no resolution, no dramatic climax, only the steady, haunting accumulation of moments, choices, and consequences that leave a lasting impact on the mind. The case also becomes a broader commentary on accountability. It illustrates the fragility of trust and the high stakes of inaction. It highlights the fine line between curiosity and negligence, between awareness and assumption. Listeners cannot help but reflect on their own lives, considering the small but critical moments where intervention matters most, where silence can carry irreversible weight. And so the story persists, not in headlines, not in fleeting fascination, but in the quiet, persistent awareness of absence. Caylee's life, brief as it was, continues to resonate through time, reminding listeners that some stories are defined less by answers and more by questions that refuse to leave. The case lingers, always whispering, a cautionary echo of what can happen when vigilance fails, and when the ordinary masks the extraordinary consequences of delay. As the years stretch on, the Anthony case evolves into something larger than a single crime. It becomes a mirror reflecting human fallibility. The focus shifts from judgment to introspection. Listeners are drawn not to the spectacle, but to the uncomfortable realization that tragedy often unfolds in the quiet spaces of daily life, in moments when action is postponed, when concern is delayed, when ordinary routines mask extraordinary consequences. It becomes clear that the most devastating events do not always announce themselves. They creep forward silently, unnoticed until it is too late. The story teaches about the subtle weight of responsibility. Every day that went uncounted, every question left unasked, every hesitation contributed to an irreversible chain of events. And in the absence of certainty, the mind fills in the gaps, creating tension, doubt, and reflection. Listeners experience the case not as observers, but as participants in a psychological landscape of delay, silence, and consequence. Each retelling deepens the awareness that vigilance and timely action are not optional, they are essential. In long-form audio, the case's power lies in its pacing and quiet intensity. There are no violent climaxes or graphic scenes, only the slow accumulation of details, contradictions, and unanswered questions. Every pause allows the listener to feel the weight of the 31 missing days, the gravity of absent intervention, and the persistent echo of a child's unrecorded experience. The suspense comes not from dramatic events, but from the ongoing tension between what could have been prevented and what actually occurred. And even decades later, the story refuses to fade. Caylee Anthony's absence continues to reverberate, not just as a case of legal significance, but as a haunting meditation on human behavior, societal responsibility, and the devastating cost of inaction. The narrative endures in quiet reflection, in lingering questions, and in the subtle, unavoidable awareness that some truths can never fully surface, and that some silences are louder than any verdict. As the narrative continues to echo through time, it becomes increasingly clear that the Anthony case is less about events and more about the gaps between them. The missing 31 days, the unanswered questions, the silent spaces between testimony and evidence, they form the true core of the story. Listeners are drawn into these spaces, feeling the tension of what was left undone and the consequences of inaction. Each detail, each pause, each unexplained moment deepens the sense of unease, creating a psychological landscape that is both immersive and relentless. This story highlights a stark truth about human behavior. Tragedy often thrives not through overt malice, but through neglect, hesitation, and the failure to act. It exposes how ordinary decisions, or indecisions, can accumulate into catastrophic outcomes. Listeners reflecting on these moments are forced to confront their own assumptions about responsibility, attention, and urgency. It's a lesson that resonates far beyond the specifics of this case, a subtle but chilling reminder that lives can be shaped and destroyed in the quiet spaces of everyday life. In the context of long-form audio storytelling, the Anthony case achieves a unique form of suspense. The tension isn't generated by action or violence, but by the slow, deliberate unfolding of silence, delay, and contradiction. Listeners experience the weight of the missing time as if they themselves are watching it pass, powerless to intervene. It's a narrative built on absence, where the real terror comes not from what is shown, but from what is left unseen and unknown. Even today, the story resonates because it refuses simple resolution. It doesn't offer closure or a neatly tied conclusion. Instead, it leaves a lingering awareness of absence, a constant, quiet reminder that certainty is rare, but vigilance is vital. Caylee's life, brief and tragically cut short, remains a focal point for reflection, a symbol of the consequences of delayed action, unheeded warning, and the enduring power of silence. As the years continue to pass, the Anthony case becomes less about individual judgment and more about the systemic and human failures it exposes. Listeners begin to grasp the broader implications, how societal assumptions, procedural delays, and human errors can intersect to produce devastating outcomes. The focus shifts from questions of guilt to questions of awareness, action, and the fragility of ordinary routines. Each small moment of hesitation or misjudgment is magnified in hindsight, revealing the subtle forces that allowed tragedy to unfold almost invisibly. The story emphasizes the fragile balance between vigilance and complacency. Every missed sign, every unasked question, every assumption that someone else would act, contributed to an outcome that could not be undone. Listeners are drawn into a reflective state, realizing that tragedy is rarely loud or dramatic. It often resides quietly in the spaces between decisions, in the moments where silence outweighs intervention. It is in these moments that lives are shaped or lost. Long-form audio storytelling magnifies this tension, allowing the listener to inhabit the slow, inevitable unraveling of events. There is no sudden shock. Instead, there is a gradual, creeping realization of what an action can cost. Every detail, every pause, every retelling reinforces the psychological weight of delay, of uncertainty, and of the unrelenting consequences that follow when human responsibility falters. Even decades later, the case continues to linger, a quiet, persistent reminder of the importance of awareness, empathy, and timely action. Caylee's absence remains central, a haunting echo that transcends legal definitions or media coverage. Her story endures not through answers or explanations, but through the lessons embedded in the spaces where certainty failed to arrive. And for those who listen, the haunting resonance of that absence continues to unfold, slowly, insistently, and profoundly. With time, the Anthony case has transformed from a headline into a phenomenon of enduring reflection. It no longer exists merely as a record of events, but as an exploration of human behavior under pressure, of societal oversight, and of the catastrophic consequences of inaction. The missing 31 days are not just a timeline, they are a mirror, reflecting how easily ordinary routines can mask urgency, how calm facades can conceal chaos, and how the passage of time can silently shift the course of life. Listeners who engage with the story over long-form audio feel its tension in a uniquely intimate way. The slow unfolding allows each pause, each contradiction, each unanswered question to resonate deeply, drawing them into the psychological landscape of uncertainty, delayed action, and moral ambiguity. The narrative does not shock with sudden revelations. It unsettles quietly, relentlessly, compelling reflection on responsibility, attention, and the human tendency to defer action until it is too late. The Anthony case serves as a cautionary meditation on trust, vigilance, and the consequences of hesitation. It illustrates how even small lapses, inaction, assumptions, silence, can combine into irreversible outcomes. It forces listeners to confront uncomfortable truths, that tragedy does not always announce itself, that legal verdicts may never capture the entirety of a human story, and that some absences carry more weight than any presence ever could. Caylee Anthony's life, brief and tragically lost, remains at the center of this reflection. Her story is not merely about crime or guilt. It is about the fragility of human oversight, the vulnerability of the innocent, and the enduring resonance of unanswered questions. It persists as a whisper across years, reminding listeners that vigilance, empathy, and timely action are not just moral imperatives, they are lifelines. As the story settles further into collective memory, it evolves into something almost mythic, not in exaggeration, but in its lasting psychological impact. The Anthony case no longer functions solely as a legal narrative. It becomes a meditation on human imperfection, the consequences of hesitation, and the fragile line between attention and oversight. The missing 31 days are more than a measure of time. They are a landscape of decisions unmade, warnings unnoticed, and moments lost forever. Listeners of long-form audio find themselves inhabiting that landscape, moving slowly through the unfolding silence. The tension is subtle but relentless, built from pauses, contradictions, and absences rather than overt drama. Each moment underscores how ordinary life can conceal extraordinary consequences, and how easily inaction can escalate into irreversible tragedy. It becomes a story not of spectacle, but of reflection, forcing the audience to confront the uncomfortable idea that disaster often grows quietly, unnoticed, until it is too late. The case also acts as a mirror, reflecting vulnerabilities in both individuals and systems. Parents, caregivers, and ordinary listeners are drawn to the story not to assign blame, but to explore the fragility of vigilance and the stakes of responsibility. Each detail, each delay, each unanswered question amplifies the understanding that silence and hesitation can have consequences as severe as overt action, and sometimes even more insidious. Caylee's absence remains the focal point, her story defined by what was lost rather than what was witnessed. That absence resonates across time, reminding listeners that justice, while measured in law, cannot restore what was never protected. In the quiet reflection that long-form storytelling allows, the case persists as a haunting study of human behavior, societal oversight, and the enduring impact of unanswered questions. As the story stretches across years, it continues to resonate not because of shocking acts, but because of its quiet, relentless tension. The Anthony case is a study in absence, the absence of timely action, of clear answers, of protection when it was most needed. Every listener who engages with the story begins to feel the weight of those missing 31 days, sensing how easily ordinary life can conceal catastrophe and how quickly small oversights can compound into irreversible loss. The narrative's power lies in its subtlety. There are no dramatic showdowns, no graphic depictions, only the gradual, deliberate unfolding of silence, hesitation, and uncertainty. Each pause, each retelling, each focus on the unobserved or the unspoken draws listeners deeper into the psychological core of the story. It forces reflection on human responsibility, on the limits of law and procedure, and on the quiet, often invisible ways in which tragedy takes hold. What makes this case haunting is not only what happened, but what was never allowed to happen: intervention, accountability, clarity. Caylee's absence becomes a presence in itself, shaping thought, memory, and reflection. It transforms into a psychological space where questions persist indefinitely, demanding attention and introspection from anyone who listens closely. In long-form audio storytelling, this effect is magnified. Listeners are not simply hearing events, they are inhabiting the tension, sensing the progression of time and its consequences. The story becomes immersive, a slow, relentless whisper that emphasizes the fragility of human vigilance and the devastating weight of delayed action. Ultimately, the Anthony case lingers not as a story with answers, but as a cautionary meditation on uncertainty, responsibility, and absence. Caylee's life, though tragically brief, continues to resonate as a reminder that silence, hesitation, and unheeded warnings can be as consequential as any overt act, and that some truths remain forever just out of reach. As the case continues to echo through time, its influence extends beyond law or media. It becomes a study of human perception, inaction, and moral responsibility. The story forces listeners to confront the uncomfortable reality that tragedy often unfolds quietly, hidden within ordinary routines. The missing 31 days are not just a gap in time. They are a space filled with decisions unmade, warnings unheeded, and opportunities lost forever. In long-form audio storytelling, the narrative's tension is magnified by its deliberate pacing. There are no sudden shocks, only the slow accumulation of silence, delay, and uncertainty. Each pause, each repeated detail, each unexplained contradiction draws the listener deeper into the psychological impact of the case. The audience experiences the weight of absence and the consequences of inaction as though they themselves are witnessing the events unfold. The Anthony case also highlights the fragility of trust and the high stakes of human responsibility. It illustrates how small lapses, hesitation, assumptions, and silence can converge into irreversible outcomes. Listeners are compelled to reflect on their own lives, considering the moments where vigilance, empathy, and timely action could make the difference between safety and tragedy. Caylee's story remains central, defined not by what was witnessed, but by what was lost and never recovered. Her absence resonates with every listener, a haunting reminder that some truths remain elusive, and that the consequences of delayed action can extend far beyond the immediate moment. The case persists as a quiet, psychological meditation on responsibility, the passage of time, and the enduring impact of absence. Over the decades, the Anthony case has cemented itself not just as a true crime story, but as a reflection on the fragility of human awareness and the weight of inaction. Listeners come to understand that the tragedy was not only in the disappearance itself, but in the slow accumulation of missed signals, postponed questions, and delayed interventions. Each ordinary day that passed without action contributed to an outcome that could never be undone. The story's haunting quality comes from its quiet tension. There are no dramatic explosions of violence, only the relentless unfolding of ordinary moments that, when combined, become extraordinary in their consequence. Long-form audio allows listeners to inhabit this tension fully, feeling the psychological weight of delay, doubt, and deception. Each pause, each retelling, and each reflection on what could have been done differently magnifies the sense of unease, making the listener almost complicit in the silent progression of events. Beyond the personal reflection it evokes, the case serves as a study in societal vulnerability. It reveals how easily systems, communities, and even individuals can overlook warning signs, normalize unusual behavior, or defer responsibility to others. It exposes the subtle mechanisms by which tragedy grows quietly, without spectacle, until its impact is unavoidable. Caylee Anthony's absence remains the emotional and psychological center of the story. Her life, tragically brief, continues to resonate, not through images or evidence, but through the persistent void she left behind. That void speaks louder than any verdict, media report, or analysis ever could. It lingers as a constant, quiet reminder that some stories do not conclude with clarity. They endure as a meditation on absence, responsibility, and the enduring power of unanswered questions. As the story continues to reverberate through public consciousness, it becomes clear that the Anthony case is less about a single crime and more about the pervasive consequences of inaction. The missing 31 days are no longer just a timeline. They are a measure of the subtle, accumulating failures that can occur when ordinary routines overshadow urgent intervention. Listeners come to understand that tragedy often emerges not from dramatic acts, but from the quiet, unnoticed gaps in awareness and responsibility. Long-form audio allows this subtle tension to unfold fully. There are no abrupt shocks or graphic depictions. Instead, the narrative thrives on the slow, deliberate progression of time, the unspoken contradictions, and the psychological weight of absence. Each pause, each careful recounting, and each reflection on what might have been done differently deepens the listener's engagement, creating a sense of immersion in the silent, inevitable unfolding of events. The case also acts as a mirror for human behavior. It forces listeners to confront uncomfortable truths about vigilance, responsibility, and the consequences of hesitation. The story demonstrates how even minor lapses, delayed questions, overlooked signs, unspoken doubts, can converge into irreversible outcomes. It illustrates that tragedy often exists in the spaces between action and inaction, between awareness and assumption, and that silence can be as consequential as any overt act. Caylee Anthony's absence remains central, a haunting presence that defines the story more than any evidence or testimony could. It reminds listeners that justice, while measurable in legal terms, cannot undo what was lost. The case endures not through sensationalism, but through the quiet reflection it inspires, emphasizing the profound impact of human choices, the passage of time, and the lingering resonance of unanswered questions. As the years pass, the Anthony case continues to resonate because it exposes the fragile boundary between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy. The story isn't driven by dramatic acts, but by the slow accumulation of inaction, delayed intervention, and unnoticed warning signs. Each of the missing 31 days becomes a testament to how small, seemingly insignificant choices, or failures to act, can compound into irreversible consequences. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension in a uniquely immersive way. The story unfolds deliberately, each pause and repetition reinforcing the psychological weight of absence. There are no shocking visuals or sensationalized moments. The suspense is built entirely from the silent, invisible forces that shape the outcome. By inhabiting these moments, listeners feel the mounting unease and are drawn into a reflection on responsibility, timing, and human perception. The case also serves as a profound study of societal and individual behavior. It highlights how easily assumptions replace vigilance, how routine can mask danger, and how delay, hesitation, and silence can quietly determine outcomes. The narrative compels listeners to reflect on their own lives, considering the small but critical moments when timely action could prevent harm, and the personal and communal responsibility that accompanies awareness. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined by absence. Her story lingers not as evidence or courtroom drama, but as a psychological echo that continues to teach, haunt, and resonate. It is a reminder that the consequences of inaction can be far-reaching, that silence can carry immense weight, and that some truths, once lost, can never be fully recovered. Over time, the Anthony case has taken on a life beyond the specifics of the crime. It has become a meditation on the fragility of human judgment, the consequences of delayed action, and the quiet yet profound ways in which tragedy can unfold in ordinary life. The missing 31 days are more than just a timeline. They are a space filled with hesitation, assumptions, and missed opportunities that together shaped an irreversible outcome. Listeners engaging with long-form audio experience the story as a slow, immersive tension. The narrative doesn't rely on dramatic twists or graphic depictions. It draws its power from the steady accumulation of silence, delay, and moral ambiguity. Each pause, each repeated detail, each reflection on what could have been done differently, builds a psychological weight that is both subtle and relentless. It forces the listener to inhabit the moments between decisions, where the smallest choices can have life-altering consequences. The case also provides a mirror for human behavior. It highlights how easily responsibility can be deferred, how ordinary routines can mask danger, and how silence can escalate into tragedy. Listeners are compelled to reflect on the critical importance of vigilance, empathy, and timely action. The story illustrates that disaster does not always arrive in grand gestures. Often, it creeps quietly, accumulating unnoticed until it becomes impossible to reverse. Caylee Anthony's absence remains the haunting center of the narrative. Her life, tragically brief, continues to resonate through the void left behind. It reminds listeners that justice measured in law cannot undo what was lost, and that some stories endure precisely because they resist closure. The case lingers as a persistent meditation on responsibility, human behavior, and the weight of unanswered questions, whispering to anyone willing to listen that the consequences of inaction can echo across a lifetime. As the story stretches further into time, it becomes increasingly evident that the Anthony case is not merely about one child or one family. It is about the delicate interplay between human choice, attention, and consequence. The missing 31 days are not just a record of absence. They are a testament to how small decisions, hesitations, and failures to act can accumulate into outcomes that are impossible to reverse. Every overlooked detail, every postponed question, every assumption that someone else would intervene contributed to a tragedy that might have been prevented. Listeners of long-form audio experience this accumulation in a uniquely intimate way. The pacing allows tension to build slowly, immersing the audience in the psychological landscape of uncertainty, delayed action, and moral ambiguity. Each pause, each retelling, each focus on absence reinforces the weight of inaction and the relentless passage of time. Unlike dramatic narratives that rely on sensational events, this story unsettles through the quiet, almost imperceptible forces that shaped its course. The case also serves as a mirror for human behavior, illuminating the vulnerabilities inherent in assumption, routine, and deferred responsibility. It prompts reflection on how easily ordinary life can conceal danger and how delayed intervention can amplify consequences. Listeners are challenged to consider their own capacity for awareness, empathy, and timely action, recognizing that even small lapses can have far-reaching effects. At the heart of the story remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined by absence. Her life continues to resonate as a haunting reminder that silence and inaction can carry consequences as profound as any deliberate act. The case endures not through spectacle, but through reflection, leaving a lingering sense of unease, a meditation on responsibility, and the sobering understanding that some questions may never be answered. As the narrative stretches further into reflection, it becomes clear that the Anthony case's enduring power lies in its ordinary context. There are no masked villains or dramatic confrontations, just everyday moments, decisions postponed, and assumptions left unchallenged. The tragedy unfolds not through sudden acts, but through the slow accumulation of inaction. The 31 missing days become a canvas for understanding how negligence, hesitation, and silence can intersect to create irreversible outcomes. Listeners of long-form audio are drawn into this subtle tension. The story moves deliberately, with each pause, each retelling, and each reflection on unheeded warnings amplifying the psychological weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, sensing the cumulative effects of hesitation and the quiet pressure of responsibility. It's a narrative that unsettles not through spectacle, but through immersion, compelling listeners to confront the human tendency to defer action until it is too late. The case also functions as a mirror for societal behavior. It highlights the fragility of trust, the danger of assumptions, and the high cost of waiting for certainty before acting. Ordinary people, routines, and environments all contribute to the conditions in which tragedy can silently take root. The story prompts reflection on vigilance, empathy, and the critical importance of timely action, showing that the absence of intervention can be as consequential as any deliberate harm. Caylee Anthony's presence is defined by her absence, a haunting echo that shapes the narrative more than any evidence or testimony ever could. Her story persists as a quiet, enduring meditation on responsibility, inaction, and the long shadow of unanswered questions. For listeners, the case remains a whisper across time, a reminder that silence, delay, and hesitation can shape destinies in ways that cannot be undone. As the story continues to unfold in reflection, it becomes increasingly apparent that the Anthony case is a study in the weight of ordinary moments. There are no dramatic confrontations, no overtly malicious acts, only the quiet accumulation of delay, hesitation, and unnoticed signals. The missing 31 days are more than a measure of time. They are a reflection of how easily human oversight, distraction, and assumption can compound into irreversible outcomes. Listeners of long-form audio feel this tension acutely. The narrative unfolds deliberately, each pause and repeated detail emphasizing the psychological impact of absence. The audience is drawn into the spaces between decisions, sensing the slow but relentless consequences of inaction. It is in these spaces that the story exerts its true power, demonstrating that tragedy often grows quietly, unnoticed, until it becomes unavoidable. The case also highlights the fragility of human behavior and societal systems. It shows how easily responsibility can be deferred, how ordinary routines can mask danger, and how silence can escalate into disaster. For listeners, this realization prompts introspection about vigilance, empathy, and timely action in their own lives. It becomes a subtle but haunting lesson on the profound impact of choices left unmade. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined not by what was observed, but by what was lost. Her story endures as a persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths cannot be recovered, and that the consequences of silence and hesitation can extend far beyond a single moment. The case persists as a meditation on responsibility, absence, and the human tendency to overlook what cannot be seen until it is too late. As the story continues to unfold in reflection, it becomes increasingly apparent that the Anthony case is a study in the weight of ordinary moments. There are no dramatic confrontations, no overtly malicious acts, only the quiet accumulation of delay, hesitation, and unnoticed signals. The missing 31 days are more than a measure of time. They are a reflection of how easily human oversight, distraction, and assumption can compound into irreversible outcomes. Listeners of long-form audio feel this tension acutely. The narrative unfolds deliberately, each pause and repeated detail emphasizing the psychological impact of absence. The audience is drawn into the spaces between decisions, sensing the slow but relentless consequences of inaction. It is in these spaces that the story exerts its true power, demonstrating that tragedy often grows quietly, unnoticed, until it becomes unavoidable. The case also highlights the fragility of human behavior and societal systems. It shows how easily responsibility can be deferred, how ordinary routines can mask danger, and how silence can escalate into disaster. For listeners, this realization prompts introspection about vigilance, empathy, and timely action in their own lives. It becomes a subtle but haunting lesson on the profound impact of choices left unmade. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined not by what was observed, but by what was lost. Her story endures as a persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths cannot be recovered, and that the consequences of silence and hesitation can extend far beyond a single moment. The case persists as a meditation on responsibility, absence, and the human tendency to overlook what cannot be seen until it is too late. As the story continues to echo across time, the Anthony case becomes less about a single family or courtroom, and more about the universal fragility of human oversight. It is a story defined by the spaces between actions, by the decisions postponed, by the quiet absence that allows tragedy to grow. The missing 31 days are not just a measure of elapsed time, they are a symbol of how easily ordinary routines, assumptions, and hesitation can shape irreversible outcomes. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension profoundly. The narrative moves deliberately, each pause and each repetition emphasizing the weight of an action. The audience inhabits the psychological space of uncertainty, feeling the cumulative effect of every delayed question, every unheeded warning, and every moment left unchallenged. It is in this subtle, immersive pressure that the story exerts its true power, demonstrating that tragedy often arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it is too late. The case also highlights broader truths about human behavior and societal responsibility. It illustrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how silence can mask danger, and how ordinary life can conceal extraordinary consequences. Listeners are drawn into reflection on vigilance, empathy, and timely action, recognizing that the small choices left unmade can have far-reaching effects. At the center of the story remains Caylee Anthony, her absence forming the haunting core of the narrative. Her life, brief and tragically lost, continues to resonate as a reminder that some truths remain beyond reach, and that the consequences of delay, hesitation, and silence can echo across years, shaping perception, reflection, and awareness long after the events themselves have passed. As the years continue to pass, the Anthony case becomes a study not just in crime, but in the subtle, pervasive consequences of human inaction. It demonstrates how ordinary life, routine schedules, overlooked details, and assumptions that someone else will act can quietly shape outcomes in ways that are irreversible. The missing 31 days are more than a gap in time. They are a reflection of hesitation, avoidance, and the small, cumulative failures that contributed to tragedy. Listeners of long-form audio feel the story's tension in a uniquely immersive way. The narrative unfolds deliberately, with each pause, each repetition, and each reflection on unheeded warnings deepening the psychological weight of absence. It allows the audience to inhabit the quiet spaces between decisions, experiencing the pressure and consequence of delayed action as if they were present during those critical days. Unlike conventional crime stories, the suspense arises not from sensational events, but from the relentless, almost imperceptible accumulation of choices left unmade. The case also functions as a mirror for human behavior and societal systems. It highlights how easily responsibility can be deferred, how routine can disguise danger, and how silence can have consequences as severe as action. Listeners are compelled to reflect on their own awareness, vigilance, and willingness to intervene, understanding that even small lapses can cascade into significant outcomes. Caylee Anthony's absence remains the haunting centerpiece of the story. Her life, tragically brief, resonates far beyond the courtroom, media, or public debate. It serves as a persistent, quiet reminder that some stories do not end with resolution, that silence can carry tremendous weight, and that delayed action, hesitation, and inattention can leave lasting, irreversible consequences. As the narrative stretches further, the Anthony case solidifies its place as a haunting study of human vulnerability and the consequences of inaction. It is no longer just a story of a missing child. It becomes a reflection on how ordinary routines, assumptions, and delays can quietly, insidiously shape irreversible outcomes. The 31 missing days stand as a silent testament to the fragility of attention, the dangers of hesitation, and the devastating weight of decisions left unmade. Listeners of long-form audio experience the story's tension in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every pause, every repetition, and every reflection on what could have been done differently deepens the psychological impact of absence. The narrative immerses the audience in the spaces between choices, allowing them to feel the gradual, relentless consequences of inaction. Unlike stories driven by spectacle, this tale unsettles through its quiet, cumulative suspense, forcing reflection on the human propensity to defer responsibility. The case also highlights broader societal truths. It shows how easily trust can be misplaced, how silence can conceal danger, and how ordinary life can mask extraordinary consequences. It challenges listeners to examine their own vigilance, empathy, and readiness to act in moments that may seem mundane but carry profound weight. At the center of the story remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined entirely by absence. Her life, tragically short, continues to resonate as a quiet, persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths remain unresolved, and that the impact of hesitation, inaction, and silence can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the haunting, irreversible power of lost time. As the story stretches even further into reflection, it becomes increasingly evident that the Anthony case is not merely a crime story. It is a meditation on human fragility, oversight, and the consequences of delayed action. The 31 missing days are more than a measure of time. They are a landscape of decisions postponed, warnings unnoticed, and ordinary routines masking extraordinary danger. Every unasked question, every hesitation, every assumption that someone else would intervene contributed to an outcome that could never be undone. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension with heightened intensity. The narrative unfolds deliberately, each pause and repeated detail reinforcing the weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, feeling the cumulative effect of inaction and the quiet, relentless progression of events. Unlike dramatic stories that rely on shocks, this tale unsettles through immersion, compelling reflection on vigilance, responsibility, and human fallibility. The case also mirrors societal behavior. It illustrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how silence can conceal danger, and how ordinary life can hide catastrophic consequences. Listeners are prompted to examine their own attention, empathy, and willingness to act, recognizing that small lapses or delays can have far-reaching, irreversible effects. At the core remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined entirely by absence. Her life, tragically brief, continues to echo across time, reminding listeners that some truths remain elusive and that the consequences of hesitation, silence, and delayed action can ripple far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a haunting meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the enduring impact of lost time. As the years pass, the Anthony case takes on a form that transcends the specifics of the crime itself. It becomes a reflection on the fragility of human attention, the consequences of delayed action, and the quiet ways in which tragedy can unfold. The missing 31 days are no longer just a period on a calendar. They represent hesitation, unasked questions, and the ordinary routines that allowed events to spiral beyond control. Each small lapse, each assumption that someone else would act, contributed to an outcome that could never be reversed. Long-form audio amplifies this tension, drawing listeners into the psychological landscape of uncertainty, inaction, and moral ambiguity. The narrative unfolds deliberately, each pause and repetition heightening the weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between choices, feeling the cumulative pressure of decisions postponed and opportunities lost. It is a suspense built not on dramatic events, but on the relentless, quiet accumulation of small, consequential moments. The case also acts as a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities inherent in human behavior and societal systems. It illustrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how ordinary life can conceal danger, and how silence can magnify consequences. Listeners are compelled to reflect on their own vigilance, empathy, and readiness to intervene, recognizing that even minor lapses can have profound, lasting effects. At the heart of the story remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined by absence. Her brief life continues to resonate as a haunting echo, reminding listeners that some truths cannot be fully recovered, and that the consequences of delay, hesitation, and inaction can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case persists as a quiet, relentless meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the enduring weight of unanswered questions. As the narrative stretches further, the Anthony case solidifies its place as a haunting exploration of human oversight and the consequences of inaction. It is not merely a story of a missing child. It is a reflection on how ordinary routines, small hesitations, and assumptions that someone else will act can quietly shape irreversible outcomes. The 31 missing days are a silent testament to the fragility of attention and the devastating weight of postponed decisions. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension intimately. The narrative unfolds deliberately, each pause and repeated detail emphasizing the psychological impact of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, sensing the relentless consequences of inaction. Unlike stories built on dramatic spectacle, this tale unsettles through immersion, compelling reflection on human fallibility and the critical importance of vigilance. The case also highlights societal vulnerabilities. It shows how easily trust can be misplaced, how silence can conceal danger, and how ordinary life can hide extraordinary consequences. It challenges listeners to examine their own awareness, empathy, and readiness to act in moments that may seem mundane but carry profound weight. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined entirely by absence. Her life, tragically short, continues to resonate as a persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths remain unresolved, and that the consequences of hesitation, inaction, and silence can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the haunting, irreversible power of lost time. As the story extends even further, the Anthony case emerges as a quiet but powerful study of human behavior, oversight, and consequence. It is no longer just about one child or one family. It is about the fragility of vigilance, the cost of delayed action, and the ordinary moments that, when neglected, can lead to irreversible outcomes. The 31 missing days are more than a timeline. They are a measure of hesitation, unasked questions, and the cumulative effect of inaction. Listeners of long-form audio feel the weight of this accumulation profoundly. The narrative moves deliberately, each pause, each repetition, and each reflection on unheeded warnings amplifying the psychological tension. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, sensing the gradual but relentless consequences of silence and deferred responsibility. Unlike conventional crime stories, the suspense arises from the quiet, almost imperceptible forces shaping events, rather than from overt acts or shocking revelations. The case also reflects broader truths about societal behavior. It illustrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how routine can mask danger, and how ordinary life can conceal catastrophic consequences. Listeners are invited to examine their own vigilance, empathy, and readiness to act, understanding that even minor lapses can cascade into life-altering outcomes. Caylee Anthony's absence remains the haunting center of the narrative. Her life, tragically brief, continues to echo, emphasizing that some truths remain unresolved, and that the effects of hesitation, silence, and delayed action can extend far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a persistent meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the quiet, lasting impact of lost time. As the story moves further into reflection, the Anthony case becomes a meditation on the cumulative power of human inaction. It is not merely a narrative of a missing child. It is a study in how ordinary life, assumptions, and hesitation can combine to produce irreversible consequences. The 31 missing days stand as a quiet testament to the fragility of attention, the perils of deferred decisions, and the unseen weight of opportunities lost. Listeners of long-form audio feel the story's tension in a deeply immersive way. The narrative unfolds slowly and deliberately, each pause, each repeated detail, and each reflection on unheeded warnings reinforcing the psychological weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between choices, sensing the relentless consequences of silence and hesitation. Unlike stories that rely on shocking events, this tale unsettles through its quiet, cumulative progression, compelling reflection on vigilance, responsibility, and human fallibility. The case also functions as a mirror for societal behavior. It illustrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how ordinary routines can mask danger, and how silence can amplify consequences. Listeners are prompted to reflect on their own awareness, empathy, and readiness to act, recognizing that even seemingly minor lapses can have profound, lasting effects. At the center of the narrative remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined entirely by absence. Her life, tragically brief, continues to resonate as a haunting echo, reminding listeners that some truths remain unresolved, and that the consequences of hesitation, inaction, and silence can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the long-lasting impact of lost time. As the story stretches further, the Anthony case solidifies its place as a haunting reflection on human oversight, responsibility, and the quiet power of inaction. It is not merely a narrative of crime. It is a study of how ordinary decisions, or the failure to make them, can compound into irreversible outcomes. The 31 missing days are more than a timeline. They are a measure of delayed intervention, overlooked signals, and the cumulative weight of hesitation. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension intimately. The narrative unfolds deliberately, with each pause, each repetition, and each reflection on unheeded warnings, emphasizing the psychological gravity of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between choices, sensing the slow, relentless consequences of silence and deferred action. Unlike sensationalized stories, the suspense arises from the quiet accumulation of small but critical decisions left unmade. The case also exposes broader truths about human and societal behavior. It demonstrates how easily trust can be misplaced, how routine can conceal danger, and how ordinary life can mask extraordinary consequences. Listeners are compelled to reflect on their own vigilance, empathy, and readiness to act, understanding that even minor lapses can ripple outward into lasting effects. At the core of the narrative remains Caylee Anthony, her life defined by absence rather than presence. Her story continues to resonate as a persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths remain beyond reach, and that the consequences of hesitation, silence, and inaction can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a quiet, relentless meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the enduring weight of lost time. As the narrative continues, the Anthony case becomes an enduring reflection on the subtle, often invisible forces that shape tragedy. It is not defined by dramatic acts or violent outbursts, but by ordinary moments left unexamined, questions unasked, and opportunities for intervention postponed. The 31 missing days are more than a stretch of time. They are a map of hesitation, oversight, and the quiet accumulation of decisions left unmade. Listeners of long-form audio are drawn into this tension through deliberate pacing. Each pause, repetition, and reflection on unheeded warnings amplifies the psychological weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between choices, experiencing the mounting consequences of inaction. The suspense comes not from spectacle, but from immersion, compelling listeners to confront the ways that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary danger. The case also mirrors societal behavior, revealing the fragility of trust, the risks of assumption, and the ways silence can escalate consequences. It prompts reflection on vigilance, empathy, and timely action, demonstrating that even small lapses can ripple outward into irreversible outcomes. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her life defined by absence, yet resonating profoundly. Her story persists as a quiet, persistent echo, reminding listeners that some truths remain unresolved, and that the effects of delay, silence, and hesitation can extend far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the long shadow cast by lost time. As the story unfolds further, the Anthony case becomes a study in the quiet, relentless consequences of human inaction. It is not a tale of sudden violence or shocking events, but of ordinary moments left unexamined, questions left unasked, and critical actions postponed. The 31 missing days stand as a silent record of hesitation, oversight, and the cumulative weight of choices not made. Listeners of long-form audio experience this tension through its deliberate pacing. Every pause, repetition, and reflection on what could have been done differently deepens the psychological impact of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, sensing the slow, inevitable accumulation of consequences that result from silence and delay. Unlike sensationalized stories, The suspense here grows from immersion and reflection, compelling listeners to confront the fragility of attention and the importance of vigilance. The case also offers insight into broader societal behavior. It highlights how easily trust can be misplaced, how routine can obscure danger, and how ordinary life can mask catastrophic outcomes. Listeners are prompted to examine their own readiness to act, empathy, and attention, understanding that even seemingly small lapses can produce far-reaching effects. At the heart of the story remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined by absence. Her brief, tragic life continues to resonate as a haunting echo, a reminder that some truths remain unresolved, and that the consequences of hesitation, silence, and inaction can extend far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case persists as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the enduring weight of lost time. As the story moves deeper into reflection, the Anthony case emerges as a meditation on the fragility of human attention and the consequences of deferred action. It is not simply about a missing child. It is a study in how ordinary routines, assumptions, and hesitation can accumulate into irreversible outcomes. The 31 missing days are more than a measure of time. They are a landscape of unasked questions, overlooked warnings, and moments when intervention could have changed everything. Listeners of long-form audio feel the tension through the story's deliberate pacing. Each pause, each repetition, and each focus on what went unexamined amplifies the psychological weight of absence. The audience inhabits the spaces between decisions, sensing the slow, relentless consequences of inaction. Unlike narratives built on spectacle, this story unsettles by immersing the listener in the quiet forces that shape the tragedy, compelling reflection on vigilance, responsibility, and human fallibility. The case also reflects broader societal behavior, revealing how easily trust can be misplaced, how silence can conceal danger, and how ordinary life can mask extraordinary consequences. Listeners are invited to examine their own awareness, empathy, and willingness to act, recognizing that even small lapses can ripple outward into lasting, irreversible effects. At the center remains Caylee Anthony, her presence defined entirely by absence. Her life, tragically brief, continues to echo across time, reminding listeners that some truths remain unresolved, and that the consequences of hesitation, silence, and delayed action can reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. The Anthony case endures as a meditation on responsibility, awareness, and the long-lasting impact of lost time. The Anthony case begins not with sensational headlines, but with quiet normalcy, the ordinary rhythm of a family's summer in Orlando, Florida, 2008. The sun shone brightly over suburban streets, children played, and life seemed unremarkable. Yet beneath this calm, a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions and hesitations were quietly shaping a tragedy that would grip the nation. Caylee Anthony, just 2 years old, vanished without fanfare. There were no dramatic alarms, no immediate outcry that pierced the ordinary morning routines of the neighborhood. For 31 days, she was missing, and the world would slowly awaken to the fact that the one person who should have been searching for her was notably absent. This absence, subtle at first, would grow into a chasm that defined the story, leaving investigators, family, and the public grappling with questions that seemed unanswerable. Each day of her disappearance unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly. The minutes stretched into hours, the hours into days, and the small signs that might have led to her discovery were overlooked, deferred, or ignored. The narrative is not built on dramatic confrontations, but on this accumulation of delay, hesitation, and human oversight, a slow, creeping suspense that grips listeners as they consider the fragility of vigilance. Investigators later described the first hours as crucial. In most missing child cases, the initial 24 to 48 hours are decisive. Patterns are traced, witnesses questioned, and leads pursued aggressively. But in Caylee's case, the rhythm of ordinary life persisted as though nothing were amiss. Her absence was, at first, almost invisible, a quiet erosion of expectation. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual, friends saw a routine summer day, and family members carried on, assuming someone else would act. This lapse, mundane yet profound, allowed time to slip away in silence. The role of Caylee Anthony, Caylee's mother, becomes central, not only because of the legal case that would follow, but because of the psychological tension her actions and inactions created. During those 31 days, her behavior was scrutinized, dissected, and debated endlessly. Was it neglect, indifference, or something more calculated? Each unanswered question compounded the suspense, leaving listeners and investigators alike in a state of moral and psychological disorientation. One cannot overstate the power of absence in this story. The missing child was a presence defined entirely by her absence, a void that shaped every conversation, every lead, and every reflection. It is a haunting reminder that in the quietest moments, the most consequential forces are often invisible. Listeners drawn into long-form audio feel this weight deeply, inhabiting the spaces between action and inaction, between awareness and assumption. During the investigation, details emerged that painted a portrait of ordinary decisions leading to extraordinary consequences. Small, seemingly trivial choices, postponed calls, delayed questioning, overlooked evidence, intertwined to create an environment where tragedy could unfold unnoticed. Each overlooked moment magnified the tension, transforming everyday life into a landscape of suspense and moral ambiguity. Public fascination grew not merely because of the crime itself, but because the story mirrored a fundamental human anxiety, the fear that ordinary routines can conceal extraordinary danger. The Anthony case became a lens through which society examined its own assumptions, responsibilities, and the consequences of deferred action. As law enforcement pursued leads, the psychological tension deepened. Investigators faced contradictions, unexplained behaviors, and narratives that shifted with each retelling. Every pause in communication, every gap in explanation, every unverified claim became a note of suspense, drawing the public and audience deeper into the narrative. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling, psychologically immersive and profoundly unsettling. Finally, after weeks of searching, questioning, and relentless scrutiny, the truth, or at least what the court would deem the truth, began to emerge. Caylee Anthony's absence could no longer be ignored, and the quiet tension that had gripped the nation transformed into a confrontation with reality. The story, which had begun in ordinary suburban days, ended not with closure, but with lasting questions, haunting reflections, and the sobering understanding that some consequences can never be undone. Her presence, defined entirely by absence, remained a constant echo in the minds of investigators, family, and the public alike. The Anthony case endures not simply as a legal battle or a media sensation, but as a meditation on responsibility, human oversight, and the weight of hesitation. It reminds listeners that silence and inaction, even in ordinary life, carry consequences that can ripple far beyond the moment, leaving an indelible mark on memory, perception, and society itself. In the end, the story is a whisper across time, a haunting reminder that ordinary decisions, or the failure to make them, can shape lives in ways that are irreversible, and that some questions, no matter how deeply probed, may never truly find their answers.